All right, guys, 1 minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we are live again, coming to you from across the divided states of America, on the West Coast and in the politically independent corner, which apparently is on the West Coast. I am your investigative analyst and radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, we are Fault Line with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get into it. First things first, we have the headlines. We repeat these at the top of the hour, every hour, 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern. Right after our first batch of headlines, we go into Jamarl's monologue. And then in about 15 minutes, we are taking calls. Your calls, 202-521-1320 is the number. But again, first, we have the headlines. So let's get straight into them. TikTok is taking the Trump administration to court, filing a legal challenge in the federal court in the Central District of California on Monday in response to Trump's executive order banning the video app by mid-September. TikTok argues that Trump's executive order is not rooted in bona fide national security concerns, according to a blog post where the company detailed excerpts of their case. It makes the secondary point that the U.S. did not conduct a fair process in its determination that the app needed to be banned and its Chinese owner needed to divest assets in America. Meanwhile, colleges and universities have started to reopen their doors and are already grappling with the realities of COVID-19, whether that's students that are protesting having to pay full price for remote learning implementations or viral outbreaks. 1 week into the fall semester, University of Southern California released a memo detailing an alarming increase in the number of COVID-19 cases. In just 7 days, 43 cases of the coronavirus had been identified among USC's population, with an additional 100 students being placed in quarantine. The university is testing students who are symptomatic and those who have had contact with positive individuals, as well as some asymptomatic students. And in the university's statement, they reported that all positive cases are related to students living off campus. That's good for them. That's good for their reopening, I suppose. The Republican National Convention, of course, kicked off last night and was reportedly well received by Trump supporters. Trump was renominated. That was in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Pence has been renominated as VP. Land of Promise was the theme of the first night, and Trump called this the most important election in the history of our country. That's a quote while he was speaking in Charlotte. Trump will be speaking the next 3 nights of the RNC 2. And in another huge story, this is moving pretty quickly from Washington over to Hong Kong, but the first documented case of reinfection has been diagnosed in Hong Kong, with a 33-year-old man expressing no symptoms after contracting COVID a second time. The man's first case was diagnosed on March 26th, and he had only mild symptoms. He was released on April 14th after testing negative twice. He then tested positive when taking a saliva test at an airport. Apparently, he had picked up another strain of the virus that had been circulating. We can go back and talk about this maybe. In fact, it would be great to talk about this with Dr. Mikhail Kogan, who I hear we will have on a little bit later this week, so we can come back to that. Our next story, Jerry Falwell Jr. may be resigning as the head of Liberty University. That's a private evangelical Christian university. This comes after Giancarlo Granda, a business partner of Falwell and his wife, accused the couple of having an affair with him for 6 years, from 2012 to 2018. Although he denied the accusations, Falwell Jr. also released a statement to the Washington Examiner in which he said that his wife had an affair and that Granda had been trying to extort money from the couple. Falwell Jr. is on a leave of absence from Liberty University dating back to August 7th and has apparently gone back and forth with the university over the actual prospect of him formally resigning as opposed to taking a step back. Jerry Falwell Jr., by the way, as many of you know, is the son of Jerry Falwell Sr., that is a late pastor and conservative political activist. In our next story, continued protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin last night. The National Guard was deployed there yesterday, and an 8 p.m. curfew was ignored by hundreds of protesters who were protesting the shooting of Jacob Blake the day before. This led to skirmishes at the courthouse and violent back and forths between protesters and police, which continued into the night. Meanwhile, Hurricane Laura is hitting the Gulf Coast following the underwhelming Hurricane Marco, which made landfall the day before, although Hurricane Laura may be downgraded to a Category 2 hurricane as it makes that landfall. So, good. Another way to say this is good. There are a lot of people who are preparing for catastrophe, and thankfully, it seems catastrophe has been averted. In our next headline, China's economy is recovering, especially compared to the U.S. JP Morgan upped its 2020 China growth forecast from 1.3% to 2.5%. And this is, I'm going to get to the real big headline at the end of the sentence, this upcoming sentence here. China's inflation-adjusted economic output will likely hit $11.9 trillion this year. That's roughly 70% of the U.S.'s expected output. And they've been closing the gap, and quicker this year than ever before. This is the big deal. A 7 percentage point increase from last year. And that is the largest advance that China has made on the U.S. in a single year, apparently, on record. In other words, within this last year, according to these projections, China will have done more to reach where the United States is economically in this year period than it had done in preceding year periods, any of them. I would say that's a big deal, especially people looking at where this virus will leave the world chessboard. Anyway, in our next headline, Elon Musk will reportedly unveil the tech from his invasive brain-computer interface company Neuralink this week. He'll be doing that with a real-time demonstration event. Again, this is a brain chip. That's the idea here. Supposed to sort of let you communicate more effectively with computers, particularly, and maybe with other people through computers. He has said that the purpose of this company, of Neuralink, I'm going to quote here, is to achieve symbiosis with artificial intelligence. Quote, end quote. In our last headline this morning, the New York Attorney General asked a court yesterday to compel some of President Trump's business associates, including his son Eric Trump, to testify and turn over documents as part of her investigation into whether the Trump organization inflated assets in order to get tax and loans benefits. Those are my news. Those are my headlines. You are all caught up, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, I would ask you what the top priority is for today, but I'm looking and I see betrayals. Start us off with that. Where
Betrayals indeed, Shane. Betrayals indeed. I want to talk about the RNC and the Democratic National Committee conventions. Betrayals. Betrayals. That is what I want to talk about, Shane. The radical betrayal of America. Not just of individual party members of the various parties that these guys were talking about. No. Because at the end of the day, those parties are supposed to get in power and represent the interests of the public. No. I am talking about the radical betrayal of America itself and the representative system itself and the constituents in those various parties that full well believe they have nowhere else to go, and this is the guy they're going to vote for. More so for Democrats. The overwhelming majority of the Republicans want Trump. This is our guy. I think it's like 70% or more. The overwhelming majority of the Democrats are voting for Biden because he is not Trump. I'm saying that however you peruse this, whether you believe that Trump is your guy, whether you believe that Biden is your guy, whether you believe you're stuck, it is a betrayal of America to have both parties to be so radical and purist as to not even pretend to represent America. I mean, for God's sakes, the world has fallen off of its axis. Millions evictions, millions food insecurities, millions of unemployed, millions of people without health care, and hundreds of thousands dead, let alone millions infected with the disease. And you bring out these two pageants that has not even a concern about policy. How? How does that work? FDR gets in office and acts like the world is under assault by aliens. That's the responsibility that he took when he got in office. Can you honestly say that with all of these plagues that are availing America, and you see these two beauty pageants that basically are talking to each other, grinning idiots, plastic faces, looking at you and telling you all of this other stuff that has nothing to do with the fact that the world has fallen off its axis? Is there not even a wisp of responsibility, a feeling of responsibility for those offices that you hold? What is wrong with you? The DNC and the RNC both trotted out the social contract and basically urinated on it in American television, grinning broadly and waving the flag while they were doing it. This is not a time for politics for the sake of politics. There are real traumas that people are grappling with, issues of policies created by the same goblins that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were trotting out. For once, Democrats, let's talk about them for the moment. They didn't even pretend that they were going to pull to the side of policy to ameliorate the rough edges. Let's listen to Rahm Emanuel for a moment. Rahm Emanuel talking about the year of the Biden Republican. Let's hear him. Clip one. Okay, maybe we don't have the clips. So we have Rahm Emanuel calling for the year of the Biden Republican. Now think about what that means. You are basically putting out a bunch of Republicans on the stage and saying, we're going to reach out to those Republicans. We're going to get those Republicans. We're going to keep those Republicans. Two reasons. One, lefties got too irascible and you needed to get rid of them. And two, if you can get those Republicans, you add on a certain level of security from your standpoint as third-way Democrats, where you don't have to look for this notion of policy. You don't have to talk about these real issues that people care about. You got those people locked, blacks, Hispanics, and lefties, entirely because they're not Republicans. Entirely because those Democrats will stand there and say blue no matter who and everything else, and you're stuck. So yeah, they can hold you in a box of sorts, but you scared them. And a sense of urgency that was necessary that they picked up on when they thought that Sanders was going to take it made them, we need something to mitigate these lefties. We need something to ensure that we can stay in political power. And we want to be able to marginalize those lefties, and we want to be able to appropriate those Republicans that basically can agree with us anyway. If you're a Reagan Democrat or Reagan Republican, you will fit right in with the current Democratic Party. They know that. So that's where they went. Policy did not matter. The Republican Party comes out and give one speech after speech after speech, going after Joe Biden whole hog, attacking him viciously, relentlessly, with one political flourish after the next. You should hear Representative Matt Gaetz. If we get the opportunity, I'm going to get that clip. But Gaetz goes after Joe Biden, empty as auditorium as empty as Joe Biden's head. And Joe Biden is going to basically have thugs and criminals on the streets, running roughshod, eating people like vampires, the moment that you put a Joe Biden in because he's going to defund the police. This was the nonsense these guys were talking about. You have one party that is basically setting a straw man on fire, and you have another party who says, look, those guys are monsters, so we don't have to do anything real. We can just play politics in the midst of a pandemic. Where is your sense of responsibility? And has it gotten so detached, meaning the device, the edifice, the thing that keeps the American public attached, or let's say our political space attached to the wants and the needs of American public? Have we gotten so far in the wilderness, in the boonies, where the representative government thing is just a shtick? It's just the thing that we say. It's just a narrative, a fig leaf, a propaganda element. And that the reality of it is that both parties have unmoored themselves like a Frankenstein monster roaming the world, where it doesn't even acknowledge that there's a public back there that it is supposed to represent. It's all about getting in office. It's nothing about the responsibility of that office. And when I say that is a betrayal in the context of what is going on out there, the catastrophes, do you realize I had a call with my mom yesterday, and we were having a conversation about trying to figure out what we were going to do with my grandmother. Because basically, the government doesn't entirely help, and it leaves families left to their own devices. There is no way for them to square that circle. It is impossible for my mom to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And yet, that's the position that she's being confronted with. Your grandmother is ill, your grandmother is sick, we need somebody to do it. You can't do it by yourself. What are you going to do? And if she was alone, she has no options. Only because I am able to intervene are we able to add in another nurse that has to be paid for out of pocket. This catastrophe, all across the United States, 50%, no options. Those families suffer, they get injured, all of the stress, they do drugs and all of these other things to try to make this stuff meet. And at the end of the day, they sit at home and cry, not having enough food, not having the ability to pay rent, not knowing where even the next rent check is going to come from. Yeah, having family members that you need to care for and pay for, and having no capacity or ability at all to do that. And your physical energies in and of themselves aren't enough. That is a catastrophe. And I hate to tell you this, that was happening before COVID, that is happening now. And that is getting worse with COVID. Those are miniature catastrophes that take place all across the United States. And there is nothing in either one of those speeches that would ameliorate that simple, basic, end-of-life condition. You have failed in your responsibilities, all of you. And it is time for lefties to stop acquiescing to what is basically a perpetuation of our current situation. This is a betrayal of America, the DNC and the RNC. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines. My name is Shane Stranahan. I am joined by Jamarl Thomas. That's my co-host. And we're coming to you from across the divided states of America. I'm going to respond to his monologue in a minute. But first, we're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is our number. Again, 202-521-1320. Okay, there we go. We're on the radio. You can listen to us there. Washington, D.C. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Oh, and we're online too. Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. We're over on Spotify. You probably know that one, Spotify. And we're on YouTube for video. Just do a search for Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Either one of those will work. Jamarl's, by the way, if you do a search for Jamarl Thomas on YouTube, you'll actually see Jamarl live most of the time, which is cooler than the other channel because we're dormant. We're not in the studio right now. Anyway, over on Twitter, twitter.com/faultlinesradio, you will find our live Periscope feed up top. Give us a follow on Twitter too while you're there, of course. And with that out of the way, those are the places you can find us. And you should, although you already have, because you're listening to us in some way. Jamarl, you were talking about the RNC and the DNC. And I think I remember the word catastrophe being used, and I remember it sounding sort of apocalyptic. I think things are bad. It's endearing how sort of honest and sincere and consistent you are in your criticisms of the system. Because they're worth it. My point is, I just don't know that okay, 2020 is especially bad. And sure, I was looking at the DNC, like the convention itself, as a sort of a spectacle with, people be like, I thought of it as the Good Morning America of political conventions. And that feeling still holds true. I'm not sure how I want to put the RNC. But the convention, I don't know. The conventions themselves aren't that bad. It's just that specifically with the DNC, I know that you watching that don't feel like your interests are at all represented, and so it's pretty damn frustrating for you. But on the other hand, the conventions aren't terrible. It's just the state of the world and the state of America in general that is arguably terrible. I don't know. What's your take, Jamarl?
Well, let me ask you this way. Rational actor. You're part of a country. You grew up believing in a social contract. And you believing that you have a representative government, that you vote for somebody who's going to go to Washington and represent your interests. Very basic, schoolboy philosophy of things, of politics. And you end up with a crisis. You end up with multiple. There are battles on the street between cops and protesters that have been going on for months. And this has been expanded now into Wisconsin, which we have no idea where that's going to go. And honestly, if those cases come back where they're not going to prosecute for Breonna Taylor, we could see an influx of that. We have, 10, 20 million people, 30 million people out of a job, meaning those people are in utter catastrophes, not knowing where they're going to eat, not knowing even if they're going to be able to keep their place. 10, 20 million thrown out of their homes is an estimate. 300,000 dead. This is just the beginning. That's not even getting down into the down the road consequences. When those PPE loans have stopped, now those people don't have the ability to keep those workers on, or those workers don't have the ability to have the extra income to even feed themselves. This is an utter catastrophe. And so when I said the world has fallen off its axis for tens of millions of people, it has. Now go back to your political space for the moment. In the middle of an election where it would think that your representative government would represent you, especially in a time like this, they give those two beauty pageants where policy didn't matter. The Republican pageant just went after Joe Biden. Empty-headed, Donald Trump as a visionary, just nonsense. And nothing in comparison to the challenge and the task that is availing us. Nothing to deal with the real anguish that people are dealing with. That's all I'm getting at. I'm just looking at this and saying, these people are trying to get elected to president. And these people are trying to get elected in the middle of a crisis. And it seems that the crisis doesn't matter. Barely even mentioned. And instead, they go into their own politics confident that if you're a Democrat, you're stuck with that party. And if you're a Republican, you're stuck with them. It's a betrayal. That's the way I see it. And if I sound apocalyptic, I would imagine for a lot of people out there, this feels apocalyptic. I'm just making the connection that in no way did what took take place in those pageants correlate to any real, rational, at least what people would call rational to the tune of life and limb and social contract. Neither one of those things had any tether to rationality in regards to what you would think if you were looking for preserving and maintaining some level of a social contract or even having some level of responsibility to the country and the offices they're trying to ascribe to. Yeah, I thought it was astonishingly horrible.
I don't know. It's a certain group of elites trying to maintain their hold on power. That's all that it is, frankly. That's what you're watching. And
yes.
The fact that's disillusioning for you, or to see it that way. The thing is that I think you already know that. I'm not coming to you with any lessons you don't know, and vice versa here, at least on this issue.
Yeah, I know, but it's this thing of I know, but there are real things that go beyond just politics.
Totally.
And
well, kind of. But if you're a political creature, there aren't. Power is all that's real. Power is all that's real if you're a political beast, and that's all that you are.
I know, but there are times
another way of looking at it.
Well, I was just going to say there are times where there's a crack in the veneer, because regardless of us knowing that, the argument that they make is we're representative government, we're fighting for the public. Fine. If you're going to make that argument, if you're going to get on the news, and if you're going to say we're fighting for America and we're pushing back against Republicans, so that's fine. Then I am going to use the argumentation of how are you doing that? And you can see a crack in the veneer, and that's what they represent versus the real world reality of what people are going through. And my point is to elucidate the disconnect between those things. That's why I take that framing of argumentation, because I try to hold them on their own petard.
No, of course. And like you're saying, they don't represent that. I see it as a sort of structural thing. I see it as they can't represent it. I have my own weird sort of parochial take, specifically like a parochial take, right? I think that we got too centralized and that the federal government built things up a bit too much. It could sound libertarian to people, it could sound conservative to people, or it could sound like anarchist or something, or American federalism. I don't know. It could sound all these different ways. My point is, that's my personal take. But I, because of that take, I see this as a structural problem that's sort of inevitable. Like, you're going to get these political elites who try to maintain their power independent from the people. When you get, in a democracy specifically, when you get above a certain size, because that's what inevitably happens if people can't effectively represent themselves. If you create a party bureaucracy to represent them, it's this self-defeating process. So I see it as mechanical. For me, therefore, it's like, technologically, socially, how do you, institutionally, structurally, how do you change it on those deeper levels? And that's another conversation. But I guess what I wanted to point out is it's just endearing to hear you sort of regularly trying to hold them to their own standard. I've kind of moved past that. I'm like, okay, what do we do to replace this? But I don't know. What you're doing is valuable too. It's just anyway. I'm just framing that. That's how I saw that. That's how I took your monologue. Was you pushing back on this idea? Just very simply, you're not representing us. Very simply, the government, both of these branches of our government aren't representing us, and that's not right. And I think that that's absolutely appropriate. Just having that perspective, having that response, I think that's a justified sort of emotional response. In fact, I think that's the justified emotional response to have, at least to the extent that it gets you to take action.
Yeah, because my point is, there are a lot of people out there that not like us in one bit. They go out, they do their jobs every day, they kiss their kids in the morning, they eat their cornflakes, and they work and come back home. And they may play Xbox, they may go to the movies or whatever else, but they live their life. And from the standpoint of politics, it's vague and something that's out there. It's ethereal. It's almost magic. And they look at their government and could think, okay, they got us, right? At the end of the day, our government does what we need it to do to back us. And there are tens of millions of those. I'm telling you, I've met these people. And they are oblivious to the larger realities of their political space. And if you tell them, look, they're not representing your interests, they'll be shocked by that statement. What? What do you mean? What do you mean? I mean, they're not perfect, but they're doing their jobs. They're trying to help America. This is just the best that they can do. And in their heads, they would frame it in those terms. My objective is to shake those people and say, look, how can both of those things be true? How can you have two convention speeches like that and come away with the opinion that, yeah, both of these parties are looking out for my interests? I am trying to show them that both of these items cannot be true. And if I'm right, and the one that's not true is that they're representing your interests, what does it mean? What does it mean? I'm trying to get the cognitive dissonance to actually come to loggerheads and say, oh, wait, that guy's right. That guy's right. There are millions of people out there suffering, and these guys are talking about Joe Biden's empty head. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to hit it from that angle. It's not because I don't know it. It's not. It is true that I'm frustrated to some degree by it, because I do realize that there are real people with real traumas that they have to deal with. And you hear these people who would tell you at any moment, who are representing the interests of America, get out here and put on two beauty pageants like this. Yeah, they should be ashamed of themselves. Both. They're not right. They're just trying to get elected. Everything else is subordinate to that. And the very fact that you have basically two parties that can play off one another, well, at that point, you can get rid of policy because it's a fight between these two people. And the public is stuck watching Godzilla and King Kong thinking to themselves, I don't have a play in this, despite the fact that it created both. Yeah, it's disheartening, to put it mildly.
We've got a call.
To put it mildly.
Wait, Jamarl, let's go to a call. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif.
Very cool.
Tarif, you were on. What's going on?
No, good morning, gentlemen. I got 4 quick comments. The first comment dealing with an interview that RFK Jr. did with Ron Paul last week, dealing with mandatory vaccines, and also what happened, the situation that happened with his father, dealing with the so-called suspect. He think that, somebody had told him that the CIA was running MK Ultra programs on how to manipulate people's minds to get people to do certain things. So I attached that link to your tweet for today. COVID hunger, Kenyans forced to hunt giraffes for food and other animals because they're not working, and because of the COVID-19, people's going out killing large wild game animals to survive for themselves and their family in Kenya. And it's probably in other parts of Africa and the world too. China average income, this is from yesterday, I was talking about decoupling. China average income for their workers is about 82,000 yen. So that works around 12,000 USD. So that means that China have a ability, if Trump can open up their economy, if Mike Pompeo don't get his way though. If Trump can open up China's economy, then we can start selling our vehicles and our Mack trucks and Peterbilts, Caterpillars, Fords, Camaros, Mustangs to China. But if Mike Pompeo and Brennan get their way, then if we completely decouple, who could buy our goods from us? We can't sell it to Germany or France because they make their own vehicles and their own trucks. South and Central America, they don't have that type of money to buy Fords and Chevys. In India is also poor themselves. So China is an emerging market. We need to stay with them and have a fair trade with them. And my last comment was something Joe Biden said last week that had me giggling. They was interviewing him about defund the police, and he said he's not about defund the police. I don't have no opinion about this, but I'm just repeating what Joe Biden said. He said he's for funding the police. That's why he got Kamala Harris, because she used to be a prosecutor, and also it's Trump that wanted to defund the police. That's what Joe Biden said. When he said that, my mouth just dropped, and I started giggling. I said, "Oh my God, Trump is going to have a field day with this dude once they debate." That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks for the call, Tarif. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff to talk about there. As always, you're bringing us a bunch of material. I mean, real quick, the one thing that I actually do want to call it, we've got to go into a break. We're going to be talking with Rahm Susli, but just on China, we're talking about trade, manufacturing, imports, exports, all that stuff. I keep coming back to this, but everybody I talk to about who's familiar with this stuff seems to think that it's important. And I don't know, the Triffin dilemma, the Triffin paradox, this idea that because we're the world reserve currency, you can't afford to sell your Fords, your Chevys, your other more complicated manufactured goods internationally because we're the reserve currency, because there's this deficit in the value of our currencies. Part of the reason that American goods are seen as too expensive is just because they're being sold with the dollar. And the dollar is its value is artificially inflated compared to the other currencies, and therefore goods bought in it are going to be more expensive for the other nations buying them. Anyway, that's really central. We've got to go into a break. We'll be right back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a second.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to us. We're Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Susli. We have Rahm Susli with us. She's a political commentator and a geopolitical analyst. Rahm, how are you doing this morning?
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Yeah, thank you for joining us. Yeah, so again, Rahm Susli, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. You can follow her by the way, on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. You can also find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan, and you can support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. Rahm, we're talking about the Kurds, Kurdistan, the fight for Syrian oil, and broadly issues in Syria right now. Jamarl, actually, we've talked about this stuff before. I think once or twice with Rahm, with us sort of seizing the oil and the fight for that. This is something you seem to have been interested in, Jamarl. But Rahm, I'm going to point it back at you. what is the deal with the oil? Is it just us trying to restrict access to Assad? Is it us trying to actually gain the benefits? Again, this is us claiming Syria's oil fields. As far as I know, these are in the east of Syria. And there was this combination of sort of like trying to reserve the oil for the Kurds, trying to keep it back from Assad, and maybe just making money on it ourselves in some way. I don't have a clear picture of this, but Rahm, what is the deal with that? What is the deal with Americans and Syria's oil?
Well, I think the main thing is to try to keep it from the Syrian government and to keep it from Syrians as a whole, because the majority of Syrians live in the areas that are not occupied by the United States. However, the area that is occupied by the United States has 80% of the oil. And I think the fact is that they want to keep Syria in a failed state mode. They don't want it to be able to rebuild, to get back on its feet, because they want to keep pressure on Syria and its government and its people to accept the U.S. occupation indefinitely, permanently. And they are holding the oil as a hostage. So that is also goes hand in hand with the sanctions against Syria. The sanctions are there to try to economically starve people out and force concessions by the government. I think at the end of the day, what they want the government to do is accept a constitution that cuts up the country and leaves the Northeast in the SDF hands. And, to the U.S., they sell it as Kurdistan. But, of course, the majority of people there aren't Kurdish. So in Syria, they call it a democratic federation. So basically, whatever, it's just a piece of Syria that has all the oil and all the wheat in it. And the U.S. is occupying that bit. And they want to divide it from the rest of Syria and they want the Syrians to concede to a constitution that would allow the U.S. military to stay there permanently in the northeast of the country, and just like in Iraq. And basically, then the oil and food resources of the Syrian people will be permanently under control of the United States hands, and they would allow Syria to have little bits of it every now and then. And that's what they want to, and that's what they're starving Syria for. That's what the concession that they eventually want. Basically, they want.
I'm glad.
But in Syria, that was the whole goal.
I'm glad you mentioned starvation, because one of the tactics that bothered me greatly, actually, has been the destruction of the wheat fields. Meaning, Trump, as reported by Business Insider, gave the command to drop, using basically, if I'm not mistaken, helicopters or Apache helicopters, to drop these kind of fiery explosions or these kind of fiery devices in order to just burn the wheat fields. There are heartbreaking pictures of people sitting in fields knowing they have no power to do anything about the crime that had just had taken place. Can you talk about that? Or can you, at the very least, talk about the effect that that's having in regards to using famine as this kind of instrument of war to whatever those ends are? Either, like you said, push the government into signing some kind of contract to acquiesce to the America being there forever, or whether that's for darker purposes of starvation with the notion of getting people to turn on their government, something that honestly doesn't really happen, especially when they know where it's coming from. So can you, A, talk about the burning of the crops, and B, what those crops mean to the Syrian government itself for its ability to feed its own people?
Sure, absolutely. So again, the northeast of the country is where it's like the wheat belt of Syria. It's where the vast majority of the wheat is to make bread. And not only have they been setting fire to wheat fields, but they've also been blowing up grain silos. And this is a multifaceted war. They're doing this for a lot of reasons. First being they want to starve Syrian people, to cause, as you said, friction between the people and the government, and possibly a second insurrection, which is very, very unlikely to happen. This is now the 9th year of war, and people have no such energy to do anything like that. Or number two, to drive the Syrian government and force them into accepting concessions political concessions like dividing the country up, and maybe even force them into some kind of a treaty with Israel. And the other thing is that it's also an internal thing inside the northeast of the country. So what Americans have to understand is that it's not just Kurds that live there. You have Arabs, like Bedouin Arabs, and Assyrian Christians that live in the same area. And some of these Bedouin Arabs have been settled for a long time. We call them the tribes. And they have their own farms and wheat fields. The Kurds are kind of using the burning of the fields as a method of ethnic cleansing. Like they're driving these people out. Because at the moment there's a heavy friction between the tribal Arabs and the Kurdish groups inside the northeast of the country. And it's gone to the point where now they're not allowing Kurdish and American soldiers into their towns and villages. So they're basically, this is something that the SDF or the YPG or the US-backed Kurds do to try to force people into their agenda, even if they don't want to be part of a Kurdistan, for example. They intimidate and burn their crops in order to achieve that. So that's three things, to starve Syrians, to get them to have some friction between their government, to get concessions from the government, and also to drive out the wrong ethnic group, the non-Kurdish ethnic groups in the northeast of the country.
Rahm, I want to come back, actually. I want to come back in a minute to the topic of the UN. You brought up these UN-mediated, that's what I hear it put as, UN-mediated talks between these three groups in Syrian political society. First, though, we're talking about economic starvation, talking about the burning of Syria's wheat fields. I've been looking at this economic chart over the last 20 years of Syria's agricultural production of various goods: wheat, barley, cotton, olive oil. And what you see is, there's still production. Wheat specifically is still decent, but everything obviously has come down in the last 6 or 7 years. Again, not to zero, but everything has dropped, and in some cases, pretty sharply. Now that makes sense, but it leaves me wondering, what is the state of Syria's economy right now? I'm guessing a lot of problems, but what is keeping it up? What's keeping it going? Where is that economy right now, Rahm?
Sure. Well, it's in tatters, especially because the U.S. has sanctioned Lebanon, and Lebanon was very much Syria's lifeline to the outside world. The Syrians were using the ability to trade through Lebanon to keep afloat, and now Lebanon's been basically shut down, and you saw what happened with the blast in Beirut as well. So, but the Syrians have something that allows them to stay afloat, which is self-sufficiency. They produce their own products. They have their own factories. They make their own drugs, and they are. I think that is the saving grace of Syria: the ability to support your own self with your own resources. But of course, Syria is also getting help from China and Russia and Iran, and that's what's keeping it afloat. So, especially oil shipments, because the U.S. has all the oil, so Syria is like without any oil at all. People don't even have petrol. And on the topic of oil, there was recently, it turns out that Pompeo admitted, and the Syrian foreign minister also stated that the U.S. is signed a oil trade agreement with the Kurds to pump Syrian oil out of the Syrian soil, and the U.S. would profit off it. So they are stealing the oil. Like, it is also about stealing the oil, but that's a secondary thing. It's 80%, maybe 90% about control, but of course also they want to make money. Like, everyone will probably come in and try to make money off Syrian oil. And
that makes sense.
Okay, Moran. Basically.
No, thank you. Sorry, there's a little bit of a time delay, so it's a little bit awkward. I'm gonna move on. You painted a pretty good picture of that situation. Briefly, we've got to go into a break in a minute, and maybe we can come back on this if it takes more time. But with these UN meetings, so what I last heard was talks yesterday between three groups, three delegations coming from Syria, one from the Syrian government, from the Assad government, one delegation from the opposition, and one from sort of civil society independent groups. I've heard that the major nations, sort of major regional influences, including Russia, Iran, the US, Turkey, I've heard that they're all staying on the sidelines. How much of that is wrong? How much of that is true? What do you think is going to come out of these talks, Rahm?
Well, if the last few years have been anything to go by, what comes out of these talks is a breakdown of any sort of ceasefire. What comes out of these talks is war. They talk of peace, they plan for war. I don't think they're going to achieve anything at the moment, but if they do, it would be a new constitution. And the Syrians are insisting that anyone that writes the constitution has to be Syrian as well. So that's why they're sidelining any foreigners, including Russia and Iran. And I think at least that is a good thing. That's promising, because then at least the constitution will look out for the interests of Syrian people rather than a foreign state. And it would be interesting because the Syrians have already voted on the constitution in 2014. So whatever is written is going to have to be put to the people again, and we will see whether they agree to it or not.
That is interesting. We're going to go into a break. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking with Rahm Sousli, a geopolitical analyst. Again, we'll be back in a minute. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Sousli. We're speaking with Rahm Sousli this segment. She's a political commentator and a geopolitical analyst. And real quick, you can follow her on Twitter at Partisan Girl. Find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan, and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. Rahm, thank you again for being with us. Talking about a bunch of stuff in the last segment. I want to get to the Kurds. What is the situation right now between the Kurds and the Syrian government? You were just talking about a trade deal with oil, where the U.S. government would be selling the oil that it currently is occupying in Syria, the oil fields, selling the oil from those oil fields to the Kurdish government under this trade deal, profiting off of it. That's one side of this. But I've heard of recent fights. I've heard of recent firefighting going on in the region in the north and the east of Syria. What's the deal there? What's the status?
Yes, so basically the situation as it is now is, it can't last this way forever. The Syrians the government is basically of waiting Americans out because they really didn't be there, so eventually they're going to have to leave. And the idea is that the U.S. agenda is actually at odds with the Turkish agenda. Turkey is also occupying the northeast of Syria. You have Turkey and the U.S. and Russia and the Syrian government all together moving around their vehicles in the same road in the northeast of Syria. And that is a situation that the U.S. military has never been in. And it's like a very, very strange peace and not peace, because basically everyone's muscling each other out. The Syrian military has been forcing U.S. convoys to leave the areas or the roads in which they control, by just telling them to go. Because the Syrian government doesn't want to start an open war with the Americans, yes, because, in Sun Tzu's Art of War, basically it says the supreme art of war is to win without a single shot fired. Unfortunately, that ship has sailed, and there's been a firefight the last week between U.S. Soldiers and Syrian soldiers. And at the end of the day, the U.S. has never been invited. And they're going to have to, by hook or by crook, they're going to have to leave. So there's not going to be a legitimization of the occupation. This is not going to be another Iraq. They've overstayed their welcome. They just better just leave because it's not. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no way the situation is going to get better for the U.S. in Syria. It would only be made better if they just leave, rather than trying to make these oil trade deals and try to legitimize their occupation permanently, which was the plan. That was what the Trump. I guess even Obama administration said that they planned to occupy Syria for like 50 years. So the firefight shows that the patience of the Syrian state is running out, and we might see further, altercations between Syrian soldiers and U.S. soldiers and possibly Russian soldiers and U.S. soldiers, which would be two nuclear powers fighting in the same piece of territory. And it could also be a resistance, because now there's resistance groups forming in the northeast that promise to push the occupation out. So I think that this peace that it's not a peace, but this weird kind of muscling each other out without getting shots fired that we've been seeing last year, that course is coming to an end, and we might see things getting hotter and progressing.
Wow.
And of course, the U.S. has, they cannot, technically they're there to fight ISIS. On paper, that's what they told the people, right? So this is becoming more and more uncomfortable.
Rahm, let me ask you this. The COVID response. So, for the most part, all of these other nations have been dealing with COVID. With Syria, Iran, sometimes those things are not necessarily, they're a bit opaque in regards to us seeing what's going on in those countries and how they're dealing with it, especially under sanction. Because under sanction makes it that much more difficult to try to get the meds and those type of things that you need. How has Syria been dealing with COVID-19 in addition to the sanctions and, of course, the ending points of war and having to make up for those wars?
Well, I think that when it comes to medication, the sanctions have made it very, very difficult to get the medications that are needed. This has been happening for years, and now the last 6 months it's been even more difficult because, of course, there's shortages. Everyone around the world wants to get drugs, and Syria creates its own drugs, but it needs the precursors, like the ingredients to create those drugs, and it gets those ingredients from India. And the fact that the Syrian economy is crippled means that the Syrian pound isn't worth as much, and so buying those ingredients is far more difficult, especially since there's a world shortage and prices have gone up. So I know that there's been a shortage of basically even Panadol. There's no Panadol on the pharmacy. It's amazing though that thankfully not too many people have died, and I think the reason is that there's not much tourism coming in and out of Syria. There's not much people that have brought the virus in, and at the beginning, the Syrian state took very extreme measures to try to stop it from spreading. But we don't know what's going to happen. It could get even worse from here. There's apparently 2,200 cases now. That's all it takes. It starts that way, but it just eventually, of course, gets bigger.
And one more question. Oftentimes when we're talking about countries, we're talking about war, we're talking about all of these horrible things, honors things. Can you give us an idea, just to give Americans this notion of what Syria was like beforehand? Meaning the infrastructure, doctors, medicine, universities, etc. That all of the people who were out there fighting, they weren't just warriors. You had doctors, lawyers, contractors, government workers, all of these people who had to basically stop what they were doing in their real life, or in their, let's say, typical life, and put on a uniform and go out and defend their state. I'm trying to get this kind of picture of what Syria was like before it became this war zone.
Sure, absolutely. When I went before the war, a year before the war, when I went there, I had a friend. Well, it's actually my cousin's friend. She introduced me to him, and we would go out clubbing at night. And he was just very, very intensely into electronic music. And basically, he was like a party animal, and he was studying engineering. And that after like a year later, that same boy was in the army and has been in the army for the last 10 years. So that is, remembering how he was like before the war versus after, it's like night and day. He's this guy, he's just doesn't care about anything. He's got a good life. He's just happy. Then he's in the middle of a war zone fighting Al-Qaeda terrorists that are funded by, the GCC countries, the Gulf Arab states, Turkey, and the U.S. So that is how I see the Syria that I remember was just everybody had their lives and their future ahead of them. Basically, we were at that age, just starting university kind of age, and people were just normal. I mean, all they cared about was getting the latest iPhone. That was the main thing that people were concerned about, not trying to get Panadol from a pharmacy.
Rahm, I actually want to ask you about something completely different for a second. I want to move off of Syria. I want to move out of the region. What do you think about what's going on in Belarus?
Sure. Well, I think that it is another color revolution. We have the telltale signs. You see Bernard Henry Levy, the so-called philosopher from France. He always seems to appear whenever some country is on the brink of civil war. And he got pictured with the opposition. I think that Belarus was trying rapprochement with the U.S. A couple of years ago, and they used that to weaken the state and then to try and cause an insurrection in there. I don't know enough about what Belarus was like before or the problems inside that country. As far as I know, there wasn't what's changed in the last 10 years. I don't think anything new has happened to cause suddenly this awakening of everybody in the opposition wanting to work with the West rather than the East. So I think it's purely about circling Russia, what was once Russian sphere of influence, Belarus, and Ukraine, is coming under, they're trying to cause a revolution in these countries and put them under Western influence to surround and weaken Russia. I think that's what's happening in Belarus, and I hope it doesn't end up being a bloodbath like it did in Ukraine.
That's the thing,
Syria,
and I'm sure. Yeah, you can see why I'm asking you about that. I mean, if you look literally geographically, just you sort of isolate out Syria, Ukraine, and Belarus on a map. If you were to just look at them, it's pretty clear what it is. It's this arc, like a banner, encircling Russia from the southwest, basically across Europe, stretching into just the barest western tip of Eurasia, obviously in Syria. So it's this. It's interesting to look at it from that perspective. But I wanted to
on each one.
What'd you say there?
Yes. Sorry, if you put a pin on each country, you could probably draw a sphere, like a circle, like a range.
Oh, yes, exactly. Surrounding Russia. That's the thing. So I was just curious about it from that perspective. I know that's the kind of thing you would watch, but also, I mean, the other thing is you're talking again, advocating for Syria as an entity. I don't want to misattribute that, but pretty consistently that seems to be your perspective. Speaking as a Syrian citizen, wanting less bloodshed and for that country to be doing better. The thing about that, though, of course, is that Syria right now is the center of this, long drawn out, weird Cold War thing that we're in between the U.S. and Russia. It just puts it in a weird position. I I can imagine it feeling the same thing if I were Ukrainian, if I were Belarusian or something. It's, again, very different cultures. I'm not trying to associate them in that way, but it's this weird, say I were in the Syrian government, I just don't know how much agency I would feel that I have, because you're stuck in this stasis. We have to go out. But in the last couple of seconds, what's your take on what that's like politically and culturally to have to live under that mindset right now? Again, maybe 20 seconds before we go.
Sure. A lot of people are angry about that. They're angry about the agency that Syria has been taken away. The chemical weapons being taken out of Syria's hands actually weakened its agency when it comes to standing up to other foreign powers. However, interestingly, Syria has been sticking to its guns because they are not backing down on territorial integrity of Syria. Which, if they wanted to, if it was foreign influence alone, they might divide the country up between themselves. But because the Syrian state is not allowing that, their territorial integrity is the main thing and the most important thing that they haven't conceded on. So I don't know how they're doing it, but they're doing it. I think with Iran,
I can hear you very clearly, and for years now, that was the voice of Rahm, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. We're talking about Syria, Kurdistan, oil, wheat, and more. You can follow Rahm on Facebook and Twitter @PartisanGirl. Support her on Patreon at patreon.com/SyrianGirl. We'll be back in a minute with another 2 hours of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am investigative political analyst, radio show host, and okay guy, Shane Stranahan.
I think he undersells himself, but fair enough. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to the headlines in the news. TikTok is taking the Trump administration to court, filing a legal challenge in federal court in the Central District of California on Monday in response to Trump's executive order banning the video app by mid-September. TikTok argues that the Trump administration executive order is quote-unquote not rooted in bona fide national security concerns, according to a blog post where the company detailed excerpts of their case. It makes the secondary point that the United States did not conduct a fair process in its determination of the app that needed, or whether or not the app needed to be banned, and its Chinese owner need to disinvest assets in America. Colleges and universities have started to reopen their doors and are already grappling with the realities of COVID-19, whether there's students that are protesting not wanting to pay a full price for remote implementations or viral outbreaks themselves. 1 week into the fall semester, the University of Southern California released a memo detailing an alarming increase, quote unquote, in the number of COVID cases. In just 7 days, 43 cases of the coronavirus have been identified among USC's population, with an additional 100 students being placed in quarantine. The university is testing students who are symptomatic and those that have had contact with positive individuals, as well as some asymptomatic students. The university's statement reports that all positive cases are related to students living off campus. As another update that just came out today, the University of Alabama reported 566 COVID-19 cases a week after classes started. The Republican National Convention kicked off last night and was reportedly well received by Trump supporters. Trump has been renominated and Pence has been renominated as vice president. Land of Promise was the theme of the first night. Trump called this, quote unquote, the most important election in the history of our country while speaking in Charlotte, North Carolina. Trump will be speaking the next 3 nights as well also. The first documented case of reinfection in Hong Kong and a 33-year-old man expressing no symptoms after contracting COVID a second time. The man's first case was diagnosed March 26, and he had only mild symptoms. He was released on April 14th after testing negative twice. He then tested positive while taking a saliva test at an airport, apparently picking up another strain of the virus that had been circulating. Jerry Falwell Jr. may be resigning from the head of the Liberty University, a private evangelical Christian university, after Giancarlo Granda, a business partner of Falwell, and his wife, accused the couple of having an affair with him for 6 years, from 2012 and 2018. Although denying the accusation, Falwell Jr. released a statement to the Washington Examiner in which he said that his wife had an affair and that Granda had been trying to extort money from the couple. Falwell Jr. is on leave of absence from Liberty University dating back to August 7th and has gone back and forth with the university over the prospect of him resigning. Jerry Falwell Jr. is the son of Jerry Falwell Sr., the late pastor and conservative political activist. Continued protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin last night. The National Guard was deployed to Kenosha, Wisconsin yesterday, and an 8 p.m. curfew was ignored by hundreds of protesters who were protesting the shooting of Jacob Blake. This led to skirmishes at the courthouse and violent back and forths between protesters and police. Hurricane Laura is hitting the Gulf Coast following the underwhelming Hurricane Marco, although Hurricane Laura may be downgraded to a Category 2 hurricane as it makes landfall. China's economy is recovering, especially compared to the United States. JP Morgan upped its 2020 China growth forecast from 1.3% to 2.5%. China's inflation-adjusted economic output will likely hit 11.9 trillion this year, which is roughly 70% of the United States' expected output, a 7 percentage point increase from last year, and the largest advance China has made on the United States in a single year. Elon Musk has reportedly unveiled the tech from his invasive brain-computer interface company Neuralink this week with a real-time demonstration event. He has said that the purpose of the company is to achieve symbiosis with artificial intelligence. And last, the New York Attorney General asked the court yesterday to compel some of President Trump's business associates, including his son Eric Trump, to testify and turn over documents as part of an investigation into whether the Trump Organization inflated its assets in order to get tax and loan benefits. With that, you're all caught up with the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Shane, I would like to talk about something that we've talked about before, and maybe is even apt, considering where we're going with this. We've talked about on the show that Black Lives Matter needs to be able to distinguish itself as something different, and that it should resist vigorously all attempts to be co-opted by the Democratic Party. It wants to be considered its own thing. It wants to be considered its own political ideology with its own ideas. And the last thing you want to do in that instance is have the belief, real or not, material or optics, that you are somehow walking in tandem with the Democratic Party. Not only is that not necessarily great for people who may be members and who may be looking to you, meaning the brain trust of an organization for some level of guidance in regards to what it should do politically, what it should be thinking about politically, what it should want in regards to policy. And the policy of Black Lives Matter diverges severely from the Democratic Party. But you wouldn't know it just looking at it. Let's hear the clip, if we have it, of Rahm Emanuel talking about the Democratic Party having Black Lives Matter and all at once discrediting that organization on national television. Let's play the clip if we have it.
It's actually an opportunity for Vice President Biden to reach across the aisle and to pull some of these never-Trumpers into the Democratic Party permanently. You wrote earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, we don't want these voters simply to rent the Democratic Party to remove Mr. Trump from the Oval Office. We want them to buy into our agenda so that they fuel legislative victories through the next decade on our core issues. How possible do you think that actually is, given that the majority of voters in either party say that their main motivation for voting this year is to vote against the other guy?
Yeah, well, I think, look, I wrote in that piece also that 1980 was the touchstone for election. That was the year of the Reagan Democrat. this will be the year of the Biden Republicans. You can see the Biden campaign with John Kasich, Cindy McCain, Colin Powell et al. Made.
There's one more clip. So let's play the second clip with Rahm Emanuel, where he gets to talk about we have Black Lives Matter. That's, again, if we have it. The order might be a little dicey just because of the changeover this morning. But let's see if we play it one more time. That one is short. It's like 10, 15 seconds.
Campaign with John Kasich, Cindy McCain, Colin Powell et al. Made a direct appeal to them. This is an election, in my view, that's kind of got two things. Donald Trump's got depth. He has his 41%. He drills down hard on them. He hasn't grown it all, but he's trying to energize that base and keep it really mobilized. Joe Biden's got breadth. He's got 4-star generals on one end and Black Lives protesters on the other end. That is a very broad coalition. And
Rahm Emanuel claims basically that the Democratic Party has got Black Lives Matter. And he claims this with the same face that conspired with cops in order to hide a video of a 17-year-old getting shot and murdered. He also claims this with the same party that was instrumental in building the exact criminal justice system, the mean-spiritedness, the discrepancy, or the skew in regards to jail times between African Americans and whites, especially from the standpoint of drug time. This is their party that constructed and built this. And he can stand there with a straight face and say, the Democratic Party has got Black Lives Matter, meaning we got them. All at once discrediting the organization, considering who it's coming out of his mouth from and who constructed brick and brick with the Republican Party, the criminal justice system we have now. Is Black Lives Matter under the thumb of the Democratic Party? And whether it is or not, the very fact that you can have a main top surrogate of Joe Biden come out and say, yeah, we got them. They're part of us now. They were able to accommodate you and masterfully just basically dance with you and being able to get what you get or what you are without giving you anything real material in terms. I complained about this earlier 4 months ago. I said, you got to distinguish yourself from who the Democratic Party is. Because the very fact that he's on here saying, we got you, the very fact that Joe Biden can go out there and give a speech with Floyd's picture or talk to his brother, those things are dramatically manipulative. Because if you go to Black Lives Matter and ask them, they will be very clear that they have gotten nothing out of this process. All of this is optics. But this is politics. That's all you need. Optics. And they are able to basically glean a certain degree of support, a certain degree of point of view, not by accommodating anything that you said, because all they did was went in Congress and blame it all on the cops and came up with a bill that wasn't going to do anything, performative trash. But again, how much, you don't need the realness part. And this is why Shane and I were freaking out earlier. It's this. They've now been able to basically masterfully neuter, accommodate the energy, and claim something of you. And what I'm going to tell you is this. When the election passes, you will be put to the side. The politics of the first 100 days will be louder. The politics of not knowing who won the presidency will be louder. And you will be pushed to the dustbin, that movement, while at the same time Biden acclimating the aspects of it that he needed to get additional percentage of vote. You're being discredited. And it is imperative that you come out with a response showing that you are not under the thumb or in the wheelhouse of the Democratic Party. Shane, what do you think about that? Because this is something that we've talked about. And we kept saying they're going to be co-opted. They're going to be co-opted. Oh, there they are. They're co-opted. Rahm Emanuel, straight face, telling you exactly what it is.
Yeah, no, it's actually kind of funny. I mean, again, thinking of Black Lives Matter protesters being under the same umbrella within the same tent as anti-Trump Republicans. But again, that's what he's doing, and that's what they've wanted to do for a while. I don't see why they wouldn't do it. It's in their interest. It's
every incentive in the world, right? Every incentive in the world says do it. Every incentive. I mean,
yeah.
Look,
so why isn't the Black Lives Matter leadership pushing back like hard? Why aren't the original
I have no
three?
idea.
Why isn't there Sean King out there? But also, why don't you see Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi disavowing the DNC? I mean, isn't that, you talk about blue no matter who? Doesn't that fit that theme?
It does. They have to. I mean, you have a criminal justice system that's basically constructed by Democrats. Now, the last thing that Democrats want is for a device of African Americans that identify themselves as African Americans to say, we don't want anything to do with you. And so it makes, like you said, it makes all the sense in the world to appropriate and manage that energy so it doesn't necessarily hurt you or create some kind of skew within your thing. But yeah, you're right. Any person that's affiliated with Black Lives Matter, after you did that, should have came on and said, whoa, that's not true. They should have. How can you not? Do you really want the party that constructed the criminal justice system? Go back and look at those videos with Biden, working with segregationists, out singing in the day races to put black bodies in prison, in addition to other Americans in prison in cages. And now they're saying that same party, yeah, we got Black Lives Matter. We got them under our thumb, dog. We got them. We have these Republicans and Black Lives Matter. And the fact is, the two policies of those things will never, ever meet. And yet, they're able to claim it as if it's theirs. Astonishing politics. Masterfully done. Masterfully done.
It's weird.
How can you take it any other way, right?
It's not that hard. Well, they have all the more power. They have the media. They have the establishment. We can do it. I mean, they can do it. Real quick, we are taking calls. That was the Freudian slip there. I was thinking about us. We're going to be taking your calls, not in this next segment, not at 8:30, but at 8:45. We have like a 45-minute thing coming up here. We're talking with Jacqueline Lukeman, also on Radio Sputnik, co-host of By Any Means Necessary. We're going to be talking with her about the Jacob Blake shooting in Wisconsin and the subsequent riot slash protest slash riots. It's really just whatever side you're on, I guess is the term you're going to use. And then right after that, that's 15 minutes with Jackie Lukeman. Right after that, 15 minutes with Mike Partika, also talking about that same topic, and then taking calls in the 15 after that. So we're going to have two kind of opposing sides, and then we're taking your calls for you to join the conversation. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Tune in every Friday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a weekly segment of the worst mainstream media headlines of the week. They tell us what's behind the worst, most misleading, and funniest headlines from around the news with Steve Patt of the blog Left Eye on the News. Together, they pull apart the corporate media's bias, spin, and downright lies. Tune in this Friday and every Friday for the worst and most misleading headlines of the week.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Lukeman. We have Jackie Lukeman with us. She is the co-host of By Any Means Necessary, as well as the co-founder of Lukeman Nation, which you can find at Lukeman Nation on both YouTube and Facebook. Hey, Jackie, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Hey, all right. How are you guys doing?
All right. So we're talking about Kenosha, we're talking about Jacob Blake, and we're talking about what's happened there. I'll just pass it right over to you. Jacob Blake apparently shot 7 times. I've heard 7 shots. That's what's in the video, and that seems to be how many times he was shot. Last I heard, he was still alive, but in serious condition, critical condition at the hospital. And then we've seen these protests / riots. I've heard it put both ways since then. What is your take on the shooting, the police shooting, and the response to it from the public, as well as the media's response to it? What is your take on this whole slate of events that's happened in the last few days?
Well, the issue is, as always, the absolute lack of due process that law enforcement too frequently denies people, Black people, Chicano people, Native American people, and yes, sometimes even poor white people. That's what this issue is. This is an issue of someone who, there are all these narratives about, he had a criminal record, he went into his car, he resisted arrest, he disobeyed the officers. We've gotten to the point in this country where several forces have convinced people that if you don't comply, you deserve to die when it comes to the police. And this is in a culture in which, it used to be that if you shot someone in the back, you were a coward. And that's not true as long as the person who's shooting is a cop and the person who's being shot in the back is someone that can be easily painted as undesirable. So the lack of accountability continues to be revealed in American policing, regardless of what this man may have been doing. At the time he encountered the police, he was not committing any crime. He did not deserve to be shot in the back. And according to the video and the accounts that have been revealed through various media outlets, the cop who shot him in the back had actually grabbed his shirt. Man had on a T-shirt, a sleeveless T-shirt. The cop grabbed his shirt with one hand and proceeded to shoot him 7 times in the back with the other. I'm not sure under what context anyone with any reasonable respect or true, sincere desire for fairness, justice, and due process of law thinks that's okay, but it's not ever okay. And this is not just an off incident. The reason people respond by taking to the streets in anger when these things happen is because it's not the first time it's happened. This is just another incident. And if we uncover the record of the Kenosha Police Department, which I think there have been plenty of other incidents of police abuse, this is long-standing anger and resentment of a police department and a police system, a system of policing all throughout this country that has systematically disrespected the lives of mostly Black people, mostly Chicano people, mostly indigenous people, mostly poor people. That's what the anger is about. It's not about one particular incident, one particular shooting. It's about we've had enough of this and all of the excuses that people keep making that allows this to continue to happen.
It's zero tolerance, basically, that our society has accepted this injustice for so long that now it becomes this thing of, okay, if we're not going to get accountability in the criminal justice system, then accountability needs to be taken by the crowd itself. I understand the logic of it. And there's something else with this case. His kids were watching. He had 3 kids in the car as he was being shot. Look, it's one thing to shoot a person in the back. It is another thing to shoot a person in the back if there's nobody around. Let's say the person is running away and you can put bullets in them. There's another order of magnitude when his children are watching their dad basically being murdered in front of their eyes. And the catch becomes what happens to those kids regarding their point of view, and beyond what happens to those kids. Even the society itself that watches that, you know, I know, that every bullet that a cop shoots, they're not perfect shots. You know, the Wendy's thing, I mean, or the if I'm not mistaken, the Breonna Taylor, those things ended up in other people's houses, meaning they could have killed other people. When cops are shooting through windows, those things could kill other people when they don't necessarily hit their targets. And the fact that they pumped 7 bullets in him, and his kids were sitting in a car, it only took 1 bullet in a moment, just a split second, to end one of those children's lives. Like, that's a big deal, right? I mean, how do you process that, Jackie? I mean, when I look at what takes place in Kenosha, I say, look, it's zero tolerance. It's not that I love it, but it's that we've gotten to the point now where we realize that these take place 1,000 times a year, and we realize that only 1% is prosecuted. And even when that 1%, it's like 33% of that 1% goes to prison. Like, so I guess you're making the argument that this is basically a natural outgrowth, a natural reaction of not having a social fabric that accommodated and ensured that A, a certain segment of it was safe, and B, when that segment wasn't safe, that there was a legal apparatus to prosecute those issues. And in lieu of that, you have the public that accepts that responsibility of themselves. Is that the framing, I think, that you're taking with us?
I think it's much more simple than that. It's just the natural response, constant oppression that is not addressed. It is, I mean, when we look at the founding of this country, and the so-called founding fathers believed that they were being oppressed by the British. So what did they do? They rose up against the oppression that they felt like they could not live under anymore. It was untenable. They couldn't take any more of whatever they said that the British Crown was doing to them. It was infringing upon their freedoms. It was making their lives unlivable. They were feeling suffocated. They felt like their rights were being violated and their bodies were being violated by British soldiers who were quartering in their homes without their, without their permission and all this kind of stuff. So what did the revolutionaries do in the founding of this country? They rose up against the British. Now, if we can understand that in the context of how this country was founded, explain to me how we don't understand that in the context of a people who have been under the system of oppression that includes police violence, the law enforcement arm of the state of this country constantly being used to abuse rights, the lives, the bodies of certain groups of people. And throughout the history of us existing in this country, we are told that we deserve that oppression. We deserve that oppression because we're violent, because we're criminal, because we're this, we're that. We don't cry. We talk back. We don't have respect for authority and all this, this, that, and the third. But there is always more emphasis placed on how we respond to the oppression as opposed to dealing with the oppression itself. And we recognize this. We know this is the experience that we have lived in this country. This is part of what the uprisings in the 60s were about: police oppression and abuse. And so we have another few decades in between those uprisings and these uprisings. And the issue of police abuse and brutality has not been addressed. So you've got a pressure cooker, and you release some of the steam a little bit, but you don't actually turn the heat off, open the top of the pressure cooker and take the contents out. You just turn the heat back up and continue to let things boil over. And then you're surprised when the pressure cooker explodes again. We understand that the core issue of police abuse and the lack of real justice in the so-called criminal justice system when it comes to certain people in this country has never been addressed in this country. It is the fundamental understanding among a certain oppressed group of people that, number one, we are oppressed. We know who we're oppressed by, and we know that the media is complicit in framing the victims of that oppression as deserving of that oppression by smearing people who are shot by police as unsavory people who were probably criminals anyway, so they deserve to be shot. They're probably going to get shot anyway. Somebody actually said that to me yesterday. Well, this guy was a criminal. He had a warrant out for his arrest, and he was probably going to get shot anyway. So these are the same people who are so invested in the Constitution and due process and the rule of law, but the rule of law doesn't apply to certain people. People know that, and they're tired of the hypocrisy and the oppression. That's what this is. Either deal with the lack of justice, or we always end up right here.
Jackie, we have about a minute left. I've got a quick question for you. What do you think is the future of the Black Lives Matter movement? And I'm going to ask it with this in mind. You're talking about the justification for emotions. Now, we're talking about Kenosha. We could get into the specifics of the shooting. We could get into all sorts of specifics. But what I'm curious about is if you're trying to amp up emotions, not you, but if the movement is about sort of generating emotional awareness and generating factual awareness about issues in order to activate people on a basic level to get them protesting, basically. You can agree with that or disagree with that. But there's something else that I'd like to see in general more in our society, but specifically on this issue, which is sort of building up institutions to try to actually change the system and to try to repair things. It seems like the Black Lives Matter, as it's constituted right now, isn't doing so much of that. And mostly it's been it has been focusing on protesting and focusing on stuff in the streets, basically. Do you see the room for that? Would you want that? Or what are your thoughts on that approach? We've got about a minute left.
Well, part of the problem is that people equate these protests with only the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement is a few years old, but the struggle for justice and liberation for Black people is centuries old. And there have been, and there continue to be, organizations that do exist outside of the Black Lives Matter movement, whatever that is, to address those issues of organizing, strategizing outside of protests, and educating people toward change in a structural way, how to advocate for that, how to move people in society to do that. Those organizations that exist, but we never talk about those organizations because people always revert to Black Lives Matter. This struggle for justice that Black people have been engaged in for centuries is bigger and longer than Black Lives Matter. So part of the problem is we need to stop looking at these protests as Black Lives Matter protests, linking it to the organization and talking about them as they are. The struggle for liberation for Black people, ongoing struggle. And there are plenty of organizations in every city where there are organizations that are organizing outside of just protest.
We've got to go. Jackie, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. That was the voice of Jacqueline Luqman. She is the host, co-host, I suppose, of By Any Means Necessary, also airing here on Radio Sputnik, as well as the co-founder of Luqman Nation. You can find that at Luqman Nation on both YouTube and Facebook. By the way, By Any Means Necessary airs right here on Radio Sputnik daily from 2 to 4 p.m. We'll be back in a minute with Mike Partika. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Partika. We're joined by Mike Partika this segment, talking about the lake shooting, what's going on in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the Black Lives Matter protesting / rioting. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. Anyway, Mike Partika is an author and YouTuber. Mike, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you. Again, first-time guest for those listening. Mike, what do you think about what's going on in Kenosha, Wisconsin? We'll just start right there.
Well, every shooting is a horrible incident. We don't want to see any of this kind of thing happen. But I think one of the things that is absolutely being left out of the discussion is what was the potential danger to the police officers in that situation. Now, we know now that there was no weapon, there was no gun in the car. How could they know that? And that kind of drives the fact that there was a shooting at all. The previous guest, Ms. Luqman, talked about due process being denied. The street is not a court of law. I mean, this is not where people get punished for whatever crimes they may or may have committed. This is where police have to react to what people are doing in the moment. And she remarked that the cop grabbed Jacobs Blake's shirt and from behind and then shot him. Well, the reason the cop was grabbing his shirt was to try to prevent him from getting into a car that contained God only knows what weapons. You know, it could have had a pistol in the front seat. Don't know. Turned out to be none, but the cops couldn't know that. So one of the things that is kind of aggravating to me is that while she's talking about how black lives are being disrespected in the streets, well, there's no consideration for the cop's life, and there's much made about the fact that his kids were in the car, his kids witnessed the whole thing. Well, no police officer is going to make a risk analysis based on the fact that, oh, you know, I may not go home tonight or ever again because this guy could potentially have a weapon in the front seat. But, you know, his therapy bills, I really need to take that into consideration. No, that's just not going to happen, and you don't want that to happen. So
basically, I'd rather be carried by 12 or judged by 12 than carried by 6. I mean, that's basically the logic, right? That the cop, and look, on some of this, I give you credibility on this, right? Because I agree with you to a degree. If you're a cop, you're in a situation, you don't necessarily know, you don't have flat fact, God's information in regards to all of the variables and everything else, and you make a choice, you make an appraisal. The problem that I have is, and I think that Jackie had, and I think that many of these African Americans have, is that particular appraisal goes to the notion of always to the benefit of the cop. Meaning you have 1,000 cop shootings, murders, killings every year, and you get 1% that gets prosecuted. And I mean prosecuted to the sense where there's actual criminality involved, where they try to prosecute the officers and put the officer in prison. And even, I think if I'm not mistaken, that 1%, only 33% of that 1% get prosecuted. So while I give you a fair point of saying that the cop doesn't necessarily know what's going on, you have to give me the same fair point that if you have 1,000 shootings a year and 99% walk, certainly all of those weren't perfect shootings. And a community that looks at those numbers and realizes there's a disproportionate skew, and not just a disproportionate skew, it's not just blacks, it's whites. We only make up 13% of the country. You're talking about 1,000 shootings. And so a community, and let's say, yeah, in this case, African Americans look at this and say, enough. That the benefit of the doubt that you want to give this cop in this moment is not entirely the same benefit of the doubt that the people who are being shot and these cases being scuttled are not being given. You don't see that whether you're calling, hey, there needs to be justice, there needs to be clear thought, people need to stop doing this. You don't see how a community can look at and say, there is no accountability in this process, especially when it comes to us. And whether this case is a specific great example or whether it was some other case that was a better example, it's less important than the fact that it keeps happening. Like, I guess I hear your point, but you don't hear the point and the counterpoint of saying this should not keep happening, that there needs to be some level of discretion by the cop that gives life, at the very least, some incremental value, as opposed to maximum justice.
Well, the point at which I diverge and say, you know, look, I'm not considering all the factors, is that whenever there is resisting arrest, which there clearly was in this case, I have a hard time looking at the system and saying, well, you know, the system is wrong. When somebody doesn't resist arrest and still ends up shot, which I have seen videos of this, that's when I know that there is a problem. But when someone has already been belligerent with the cops, and I mean to the point of resisting being restrained, I don't know how many people have seen both sides of the video. There's two different kinds of angles that are out there, but when the whole filming starts, he's like seated on the ground and they're trying to either put cuffs on him and put him into some restraining hold, and he manages to break free of both of them. And then that's when he walks around the front of the car, and the other officer is trailing him with the gun, and they're not sure exactly what he's going to do next, and then he tries to get into the car, and that's when things become a potentially life-threatening situation to the cops. Now, if he had complied with their instructions, he'd be alive. I mean, well, he's still alive. Thank goodness for that. In fact, the last I heard, he's in stable condition now. So, you know, I'm looking at the situation and saying, okay, we really have to look at a bunch of these cases that are trotted out in front of us as far as the Black Lives Matter list of victims goes. You know, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd even. All of these people who were supposedly taken down by the cops for no reason, you know, they gave reason. There was resisting arrest involved, and until that becomes less of a factor, we can't really tell if the system is broken.
So just to be clear, resisting arrest equates to death. Meaning, if I resist the cop, then that cop can take maximum justice. I'm just trying to understand, because there is resisting arrest that does not put the officer's life in danger. Meaning, if I am going in the opposite direction and you're shooting me in the back, then yes, you can make an argument he resisted arrest. You can make an argument that he even got physical with the cop. But does that give deference to basically ending that man's life? Especially if the officer's life is not in danger. Look, wait, real quick. I agree with you. When I see cases and I say, oh, don't do that, and I'm screaming at the camera because I know that there are going to be people who say, it doesn't matter if the cop's life was in danger. The very act of his resistance in and of itself made maximum justice a thing that was perfectly okay. My argument is that's not true. That if there's another rational way of ensuring that that person who's not acting at his best gets home that night, then that's a viable option. And that if maximum justice is on the table and another option is on the table, take the other option. I don't care if the person resisted arrest. I care if the officer's life was in danger, yes. But if there's any other option that could be taken where that guy goes home, I think that cop should be prosecuted for that. Because it's his responsibility, in some case, it's some value to care about the guy's life also.
Well, I think this is where we need to get police input, because police are the ones who are trained out there to take care of situations like these, and they would have the most knowledge on what other options are actually available. But the moment that Jacob Blake got in his car, if he had a weapon within reach, he could have easily just flung it around and started blasting. So the cops, I don't know how the cops had any other option at that point.
What about things like tasers? That's it could be a side comment. One of the other ways I've
tried to tase him.
What'd you say?
And I've heard that they've tried to tase him, and I have seen a video of people who were tased, and yeah, it put them on the ground initially, but then they got right back up, and then they actually, there's a video that I retweeted earlier yesterday of a man who was tased, and he was tased a couple of times, and then he fought off both the police trying to apprehend him, and then he got into his car and pulled a gun. I mean, that would have been the other side of the Jacob Blake story if there had been an actual gun in the car. Maybe there would be some shot cops like there were in this particular video.
Mike, I can see you the story where the cop tells the guy, he says, hey, go get your license. And when the guy goes for his license, he shoots the guy and says, you reached. And the guy says, you told me to get my license. Look, you can come up with all kinds of paranoid scenarios. I get it. And I don't take anything from a cop in regards to the fear and the terror that they're probably having in the moment of their job. I don't. I get it. And I am not even going to be one of those people that second guess if it's one of those things where it's like, okay, fair enough. That guy, there's no way for that cop to, he had to dispense maximum justice. But by the same token, I look at the number of shootings, and I know that those shootings aren't perfect. I also know that those number of shootings, 1,000 a year, when you have 1% that gets prosecuted, that means that there are 99% of those shootings where people just walk. And I'm not saying you, but people often go with this notion that, hey, it was a clean shoot. There was no way that all 99% of those were clean shoots. And even in this case, I don't agree with you that it's okay to dispense maximum justice when the person balks or when the person pushes back at the officer. Look, the officer has to account some risk. Like, you can't have a situation where the officer is on the street and it's like, I am not encountering any risk. I am coming home to my wife tonight. I understand the want of that perspective. By the same token, that's not the job. And there are times where you have to take that extra step to say, I'm going to take this guy down as opposed to put this guy away. Honestly, if the taser is that ineffective, then you shouldn't have tasers. And tasers are effective, meaning you should have went for that. Even if you tase them once, you should have tased them again. There are cases where cops tase people like 20 times. I'm making a point to you, Mike, that is there not any responsibility to ensure that that person that's behaving badly gets home? Is there not? I mean, is it really does boil down to any level of noncompliance can result in a put down, a bullet in that person or multiple bullets?
I would say that the moment that the cop is at risk of his life, he's got to take whatever steps are reasonable. And if you're saying that there's another reasonable step besides taking a shot, I would agree with you, but I don't really know that option was there in this particular incident. I really don't. I mean, that's what
certainly
I would
the
want
standard
to hear
can't
from
be.
law enforcement officers and say.
There's this other point. So, Mike, we only have
Shane, I'm sorry.
There's this other point, which is, no, sorry, didn't even hear you starting to talk there, Mike. In our last minute, I suppose, the per capita rate. This is the thing about the U.S. We've got to go out, but the U.S. rate of per capita police shootings is way higher than other countries you would think to associate us with. So, I mean, right around us, we're not at the top of the list, but we're kind of close. And right around us are like Iraq, Nigeria, Kenya, Iran, Angola, Colombia, Mali. I mean, various sort of like not Western countries that you would think might have a slightly higher rate of violence. The closest country that I would fit in that category is probably Canada. Their per capita rate of police killings, according to the numbers I'm looking at right now, at least 9.7. That's per 10 million, whereas in the U.S. it's like 3.5 times higher at 34.8. That's a pretty significant jump. Is there something cultural? What do you think is at the heart of the discrepancy there between how different countries handle policing?
Were you saying that Canada was higher or lower than the U.S.?
Lower, like 3.5 times lower. The United States, among other sort of, it's the highest, as far as I can tell, of the developed countries on per capita police killings.
I would almost have to chalk that up to the fact that we have the Second Amendment and we have individual gun ownership, and that means that any potential traffic stop is going to end up in a shooting. Cops are facing the unknown every day, and who knows what somebody has in the glove compartment.
Interesting, man. That would become an interesting conversation itself. I kind of wonder where you are.
Wait, but just to be real clear before we close this, cops are safer than garbage men. You realize that, right? When you look at the averages and you look at everything else from the standpoint of statistics, cops are safer than garbage men.
Do trash compactors eat garbage men on a regular basis? I don't know where that statistic comes from.
Look it up. It's true.
Yeah,
cops are not the most dangerous job in our system, in our society.
That's interesting. I need to look into that. We've got to go into a break. We're slightly over time. Thank you for joining us, Mike Pratika. Everybody listening, again, thank you, Mike. He's an author and a YouTuber. Appreciate it. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking calls 202-521-1320. Again, though, Thomas and Stranahan, Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the... Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And you, if you'd like, are taking calls 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320 is the number if you want to call us. We can talk about the Jacob Blake stuff, the Kenosha stuff, anything you want to, really. Jamarl, you just posted the link in our little private chat. The garbage collectors are more likely to die on the job than police patrol officers. Here might be.
I've been reviewing this for a while.
That's police patrol.
Patrol officers. Well, they're police officers. That's kind of my point that I'm making.
That's the thing.
He made the point that a cop could go to a glove compartment and any car.
He's going to run into a person.
Right.
I get you. Yeah.
So
I just
don't.
need to look. But
I hate these type of. I gotta be honest. I often hate these type of back and forths. because I can give deference and say, if that was me, if I was a cop, in fact, two ways. We in this country ask cops to do things that they just can't do. I mean, let's be very honest. If you're looking at a society where you're talking about poverty and you know this, like this is not even conceptual. And it's like, if you have a society that's constant in poverty, it's like, okay, we're not going to deal with the poverty. We're just going to throw people in with guns. What result do you think is going to occur? It is impossible for them to do that. And so, all right, so now we have to deal with the individual situations of a person being put in that spot. And let's say you have 1,000 instances of people being put in that spot. What is the outcome? I guarantee you it will be the exact same outcome. Meaning, regardless of who you put in that spot, the people who are going to be attracted to those jobs and the situations you're going to be putting them in are going to be asking them to make instantaneous decisions. And even if there is another logical path that can be taken, the very ideology of the cop thing, this, you define my authority, and then maximum justice. And then you have people that say, it doesn't really matter if there was another path of action that could be taken. That guy didn't do exactly what the cop said as fast as the cop wanted him to do it. And so he was fair game to be tased or shot. I'm saying that's obscene, and that your society should care more about the citizens than it does, where it doesn't accept that nonsense of, okay, he resisted, so it's fair game, and has some level of accountability to the cop that says, yes, he resisted, but there were other viable options that you could have taken as opposed to maximum justice. That's what I'm asking. That's what Jackie is asking. That's what you could say the overwhelming majority of African Americans are asking. Because I tell you this, we also would like to use the cops, and we would like to be able to call the cops without getting shot, despite the fact that we were the ones that called the cops. I mean, for God's sake, I don't think I'm asking for anything extravagant. Look, I agree with you looking at the pictures. That's riot. That's, that gone well beyond a protest. When you're setting a cop station on fire, that's a riot. It's a secondary question whether you think it's right, wrong, okay, mechanical, anything else. I'm just saying it's flat fact, what it is, what it looks to me. I'd be terrified with, something burning down and people with bats knocking out car windows and cops wielding and swinging at anything in sight. That's chaos. It's chaos. So
yeah,
I want
to.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I just wanted to make the point clear and give my framing and how I look at this stuff. And why I gotta be honest, I'm not thrilled by these type of conversations, because to me, it's like the points of view sometimes gets hard, and it's like if I give you deference, it's like, yeah, I get to see your point. I to some degree want some deference and to say, okay, fair enough, I can see yours, and we can meet in the middle even if we don't necessarily agree, and that doesn't necessarily seem to occur.
Yeah, and I mean, I think about this stuff on air and off, and I was sitting there during both of those calls, and I'm trying to think of not just meaningful things to say, but I'm also like, what's the real core of the issue here? If you were to be able to find a gentle place where different sides could actually not agree with each other, but like hear each other, what would that terrain look like? What part of the conversation would that be in? How would you have to get there? And I still don't know how to do that. And I think
elimination poverty.
You got to do it.
Eliminating poverty.
What'd you say?
That's how you get there.
Poverty?
I think, look, I honestly do. Like, I don't think it eliminates it all. Like, I can't stop a person from being racist per se, so fair enough. But what I can do is say, I am going to bring down the number of instances that these cops are going to engage with this population. And in doing so, lowering the numbers of interactions. Now, I can't stop the 1,000, but maybe I can cut it to 500. And as abominable as that is, that's better than 1,000. Good.
Isn't that coming to it with empathy for both sides, though? And I'm not saying that you're not doing that, but it's easy because we're in a thing where you're taking both sides. Like if you come to it with the people who are being shot and are potentially going to shoot the cops shouldn't be in that position. The cops shouldn't be in that position. And
correct.
It's really like straightforwardly, it seems like we can both factually state those things, and we can disagree maybe on some of the marginal issues, but we've come to an agreement pretty quickly there.
Yeah,
I don't know. How do we get to that actual conversation? How do we make that a sort of axiom that we can then build on? We've got calls, by the way. We've got a couple. I think we should go to them before we get.
Yeah, let's go to the calls, but just real quick, you can't, because the people in your political class has just made the assumption that says, look, it is easier, cheaper to throw in cops as opposed to dealing with the real issue, and that's what I said they were going to do months ago. I said every incident in the world has them to do that. Because if they were going to do something about it, they would have did it already. It's not like the information is not out there.
Well, maybe
it's just cops are their way of trying to,
figure that out.
you know, yeah. So yeah,
But
you're right. We have callers. I'm sorry.
Here's the thing is, there are turtles beneath that one too. You know, they're like, yeah, we should work this stuff out. But we've got callers. We've got Rod calling in from Philly. Rod, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, guys. You know, I hear us talking about this shooting incident, and I don't. It's kind of frustrating in the sense that only when the media picks up a police shooting do people get emotionally involved.
Right.
When you have cities up and down the I-95 corridor, Midwest, down south, Southwest, West Coast,
Chicago,
double-digit shooting almost every single day.
Yep.
Women, children, pregnant women, old women, innocents. You can literally see videos of people getting robbed, shot. I'm talking about innocent people just walking, playing in the playground. Just the other day in Philadelphia, a father was playing with his 3- and 9-year-old and was shot. You know, but the news, the national media doesn't pick it up. But when it's a shooting of a black man by a white officer, they jump on it like a hyena jumping on a lion that's left alone. And then it's an emotional reaction. So then it becomes about policing and all the other stuff. And you know, Jamarl, I'm with you on the poverty angle, but the reality of ending poverty, me and you will never see it. We'll never see it. If you do want to get to the lowest poverty level ever, that means you have to realize that you'll never see it. It's a path that's so far from where we're living. I'm in my 30s, and I believe you said you're in your 40s. You'll never see it.
I'm in my 40s.
Yeah. Also be cognizant of that. But in this instance, I don't know anything about that part of Wisconsin. I'm not 100% sure. It seems like they were in a I don't know what kind of neighborhood it is. Honestly, I don't know anything.
Rod, what do you mean by we'll never see it? When you say we'll never see it, do you mean we as a society? I mean, you're talking about you and Jamarl as individuals.
No. I
but
mean,
what do you mean by that?
I'm talking about us living right now. I believe you're in your 20s. I'm in my 30s. I believe Jamarl said he's in his 40s. To see, there'll never be an end to poverty because there's always been poverty through civilization. But the lowest, talking about the lowest level of poverty, you have to realize the work progress of that, it'll take your lifetime. So your children or your grandchildren will be the benefactors, not you. That's how the progress works.
I guess, yeah. You know what? Here's another thing, and this is kind of something, I don't know how to get this across. It seems like, and this might not be exactly where you're going, but it kind of reminds me of it. Wealth is something you build kind of intentionally with like smart decisions over decades or centuries or, long periods of time. On the other hand, there's this idea that, you have a class of immensely wealthy people that you can redistribute from. But it seems like there's some weird paradoxical contradiction here, where on the one hand, we expect them to be able to disperse wealth as if they can magically create it, when all that they've done, as far as the sort of traditional left-wing narrative goes, is parasitize the wealth from the working classes. And then on the other hand, that they can redistribute it. I don't know if I'm even making sense here. What's your take on this stuff, Rod? How would you try to solve the problem of poverty, or do you see it as just sort of a distraction, something that's too far out on the horizon, and we should focus on what's more in hand? What's your take, Rod?
Ending poverty goes hand in hand with, you can't end corruption. That's something that's in a sense built in, but you have to be able to punish corruption. We don't punish corruption in this country. You see low-level people, but when you look at the top, these people are rich by means we can't even believe. We can just name off anybody. It doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican. They're filthy rich, whether most of them have not got it by ethical means. They do it behind the scenes and with, through voting and whatnot.
Hey, Rod, tell me something real quick. Quick question. I have a video that I can show you that has how China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. How did China do it and make that possible to the tune of, again, hundreds of millions, because there's a billion people in China, but it's impossible for the United States to do it?
Well, that's a whole another topic, just speaking of China. Let me just get to this real quick. I'm first generation American. My parents come from Central America and the Caribbean. So I have a deep understanding of what poverty is like. And when we talk about China, where we're just fast forwarding to now, China's a place. I mean, where is the transparency in media to find how they did it, how it's working, and how the citizens feel about it? From what I just heard about a week ago, they said 8 million cell phone numbers disappeared. Just disappeared. That's a lot. So, I mean, I understand how we go about China, but China at the same time has a entanglement, I guess you could say, with America and how it's being funded, as we see with our politicians and their involvement with China. So I don't have the totality or even enough to speak about China to say, oh, well, this is how they did it.
Rod, I'm sorry. We've got to go. I'm sorry. We've got one more call to take. We've got like a 45 seconds or something before we've got to go out. Thank you for the call. I don't mean to cut you off, but it's just time. We've got Brian calling in from College Park. What's on your mind, Brian?
Hey guys, good show. Quick question. Jamarl, you always talk about class and race. What do you guys probably already talked about this, but reparations and to resolve poverty. And I know certain states have their own reparations bills coming up, but what do you guys think about reparations in a federal level, solving issues like crime and other stuff?
I'm for it. I mean, I think it's politically difficult, or at the very least it was, when Sanders was running, so I wasn't necessarily an advocate for it, even though I agree with the premise and I agree that, yeah, this is right. It's right from the standpoint of a government put in laws to make a person's body a commodity. And a lot of work was dispensed with that body. And then nothing was given as a remuneration. Yeah, I think it's right, just from a standpoint. How do you get it across? That's a different question. So, Shane, what do you think?
Jamarl, sadly, we've got to go out. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to the last hour at this point. We're just about to go into it of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we're back again, coming to you live and alive across the divided states of America, on the West Coast and in the politically independent corner. I am your investigative political analyst and radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
And on the East Coast and in the left corner, I am the indefatigable. And on the East Coast, in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Man, it's a beautiful view up here. Together on that wall, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. For this, we're taking calls. I hear there was some miscommunication there. Here we have some other callers who didn't manage to join us. If you called in and you didn't get through, or if you didn't call in but you want to get through, please call 202-521-1320. We'll be with you in about 10 minutes, I'd say. But first, we have the headlines. Right up top, the Republican National Convention kicked off last night. Reportedly well received by Trump supporters, Trump was renominated as the presidential candidate, and Pence has been renominated as the vice presidential candidate. Land of Promise was the theme for the first night, and Trump called this the most important election in the history of our country, quote, end quote. That was while he was speaking in person in Charlotte, where the event kicked off. He will be speaking at the next three events, too. Not in person, though, I hear. And this is before Thursday on the White House's South Lawn, where he will reportedly be speaking again. In our next story, TikTok is taking the Trump administration to court, filing a legal challenge in the federal court in the Central District of California on Monday. This comes in response to Trump's executive order banning the video app by mid-September. TikTok argues that Trump's executive order is, quote, not rooted in bona fide national security concerns, end quote, according to a blog post where the company detailed excerpts of their case. It makes the secondary point that the U.S. did not conduct a fair process in its determination that the app needed to be banned and its Chinese owner needed to divest assets in America. Colleges and universities have started to reopen their doors and are already starting to grapple with the realities of COVID, whether that's students that are protesting, having to pay full price for remote learning implementations or viral outbreaks. 1 week into the fall semester, University of Southern California released a memo detailing, quote, an alarming increase, end quote, in the number of COVID-19 cases. In just 17 days, 43 cases had been identified among the student population, among USC's population, with an additional 100 students being placed in quarantine. The university is testing students who are symptomatic and those who have had contact with positive individuals, as well as some asymptomatic students. The university's statement reports that all positive cases are related to students living off campus. Just interesting to note that, too. Also, the first documented case of reinfection in Hong Kong, a 33-year-old man there expressing no symptoms after contracting COVID a second time. The man's first case was diagnosed on March 26th. He had only mild symptoms. He was released on April 14th, 3 weeks later, after testing negative twice. He then tested positive when taking a saliva test at an airport. He had apparently picked up another strain of the virus that had been circulating. Back in the U.S., Jerry Falwell Jr. may be resigning from the head of Liberty University, the private evangelical Christian university. This comes after Giancarlo Granda, a former business partner of Falwell and his wife, I guess current business partner, although things have been strained, accused the couple of having an affair with him for 6 years from 2012 to 2018. Although he denied the accusations, Falwell Jr. also released a statement to the Washington Examiner in which he said that his wife had had an affair with Granda and that Granda had been trying to extort money from the couple. Falwell Jr. is on a leave of absence from Liberty University. That is the university in the center of this, dating back to August 7th, and has gone back and forth with the university over the prospect of him resigning. Jerry Falwell Jr. is the son of Jerry Falwell Sr., is the late pastor and conservative political activist. We were talking about this a lot last hour. Continued protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin last night. The National Guard was deployed to Kenosha, Wisconsin yesterday, and an 8 p.m. curfew was ignored by hundreds of protesters who were protesting the shooting of Jacob Blake. This led to skirmishes at the courthouse and violent back and forths between protesters and police. Hurricane Laura is hitting the Gulf Coast today following the underwhelming Hurricane Marco, which made landfall yesterday. Although Hurricane Laura may be downgraded to a Category 2, a Cat 2 hurricane, as it makes landfall. Again, it's a good thing that these are taking less of a toll than we thought they would. We thought they'd be hitting pretty hard. They were back to back, which is rare. I think almost a century. Getting back to the Great Depression was the last time we had seen these back-to-back hurricanes hitting. But it seems like they lessened in severity as they approached the coast. And that's of course good for all the inhabitants there. The show has some friends out there, I hear. China's economy is recovering, especially compared to the U.S. JP Morgan upped its 2020 China growth forecast from 1.3% growth to 2.5%. And China's inflation-adjusted economic output will likely hit, this is an estimate, $11.9 trillion this year. That's roughly 70% of the U.S.'s expected output. So still a lag there, but this is the big deal. It's a 7 percentage point increase from last year, and that's the largest advance that China has made on the U.S. in a single year. We'll see how quickly those tables turn. We'll see how quickly the overall output balance shifts there. Again, though, talking about this last hour, maybe we can pick it back up. This is one of those topics. China also has dramatically higher population, dramatically higher number of people living there. So more to it than just the pure economic. It's also per capita growth. Anyway, next story. Elon Musk will reportedly unveil the tech from his invasive brain-computer interface company, Neuralink, this week. That'll be in a real-time demonstration. These are, again, invasive brain chips, basically, that would allow you to communicate with computers more effectively than your smartphone, I guess, which is, I would say, I'll come back to it after headlines, but the smartphone is probably the most effective way to communicate with computers for most people right now, and that's why they're so darn popular. Anyway, Elon Musk has said the purpose of that company is to achieve symbiosis with artificial intelligence, quote, end quote. Jamarl, you're a fan of Star Trek. Again, we'll come back to it, but doesn't that sound Borg-like? Okay, again, last headline here. New York Attorney General asked a court yesterday to compel some of President Trump's business associates, including his son, Eric Trump, to testify and turn over documents as part of her investigation into whether the Trump organization inflated assets in order to get tax and loans and benefits. And with that, you are all caught up. That's the news. Those are the headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Jamarl, that's the thing with the Neuralink. Doesn't that strike you as Borg-like? I mean, you're a Trekkie or a Trekker, whatever the term is. Doesn't that remind you? Don't your concerns go exactly there? That's kind of where I go.
I have a Neuralink, believe it or not. I bought one years ago. There's these things where you put it on around your head, and it allows you to see your brain waves, and you can have little programs and software
That's not
programs.
exactly the same thing.
You say you have one?
No, but I've done those. That was a cool experience, but that's not exactly the same thing.
It's not exactly the same. No, I mean, this is not going in your head. This is more so around your head, and it's using your own. Like, the goal of it is to get your abilities to be able to control to some degree your various states of thought. But they're talking about something different. He's talking about like putting a chip in your head and having that ability to look. I think humanity has to come to terms with something. As you develop your technology, as you develop all of these things, these tools that allow you to interact with your world, you're basically creating an overlay on reality. And your ability to interact in that virtual world allows all sorts of learning opportunities, but it also allows all sorts of ideas on entertainment, and entertainment in a way that goes far more visceral than not. It also allows bad actors who can, let's say, create a glitch in that and have you thinking, you're on the moon somewhere. So it's scary on multiple fronts, and it's problematic in a world where the objective is power and dominance. Because the last thing you want is somebody having something in your head and having some level of leverage with that thing in your head. For that matter, even your appraisal of reality could somehow be jacked up with items in your head, depending on the levels to which those things go. So yeah, it is Borg-like.
And then you add
classism.
Disturbing. You can add classism too. I mean, there's this idea, Elon Musk. Actually, I went to a conference. I've been within like 15 or 20 feet of Elon Musk or something one time. It's in a hallway at this conference. Anyway, this like effective altruism conference back in, I think, 2015 or something like that, on charities and stuff. Anyway, he was talking there, and he talked about Neuralink briefly, and this might have been before that. I think this was after he had announced it, but I remember him talking about the idea, interestingly enough, because this was the kind of thing that, weirdly enough, these folks like to talk about. It's like the far future, artificial intelligence, some cases the threat of like genetically engineered pandemics or things like that. Weird resonances with a lot of what people think is going on this year. Some people, anyway. He's talking about the Neuralink, and one of the things that he brought up then, and one of the things that I've seen people bring up about Neuralink, the company, since then, and what you could do with the tech is it's this idea that you can harness in the same way that you add RAM onto a computer or you upgrade your processor. If you can harness the cloud, quote unquote, if you can harness computing, distributed computing, in order to upgrade your own cognitive capacities, and if you could do that on a real time by renting it, think about, I want to think harder for the next day, so I'm going to rent out computers using my Neuralink to help me do that. What you get through how our current economic system works, something like modern capitalism or whatever, unregulated, what you get is like these hugely disproportionate, enforced technological cognitive hierarchies. And that is also terrifying. This idea that you would have classes that are perpetuating themselves, and you can look at this from classes, or you can just look at this as a sort of elite thing, not even an economic class, but just an elitism versus populist, or however you want to look at it. A class or a group of elites that are able to reinvest in their powers, not just materially, but psychologically, in terms of what they're personally capable of. That's terrifying. That sets up the state for ultimate oppression. I don't know. I was saying the Borg thing is what strikes me, but if I'm going to be honest, that's what really terrifies me. These horrible trenches that you can build.
It also creates a situation where workers, like, we need X amount of cognitive abilities to work here. And so you get a section of people that are janitors, because, it's like almost a class of janitors. And then you get other people who basically work jobs that you can only even get the job. Because think about what would happen. You may start off with somebody saying, okay, we have a mental defect, and this fixes blindness, this fixes some kind of ear issue, this fixes whatever, this deals with pain. And then those people get a benefit and said, wait a minute, my cognitive abilities have upped. And you have companies that start selling it from the standpoint of, You can sharpen your memory. You can sharpen your intellect or IQ in a particular area. And you have a class of jobs where the only people that can get those jobs are people with neural links, because that's the way those people at that point communicate. It becomes cheaper, faster. You do it in a virtual environment. Hell, you may not even need to use material like physicality and moving that stuff, just your mental process alone doing the job. Then what happens to a large class of people who can't afford it, who don't want it, who don't believe in it, who believes it's not safe? Well, those people become marginalized. And the problem, if it's a problem, is that at some point, in order for you to even keep up with your computer systems by themselves, you would need some kind of augmentation for the human body to interact with it on that level. Like
well, that's what he said he wants to do. That's actually, I mean, to get right to the nub of it, he's talking about symbiosis with AI. That's actually why he's justifying it, or ultimately the like moral cause or the purpose or the plan there is that the idea is humans are going to compete with AI, but if you can sort of make them symbiotic, if you can make them a symbiote, this sort of synergistic single organism, then you don't leave humans in the dust. And it's this transhumanistic view of things. It's also just hellaciously controversial, and every slippery slope argument starts to apply. You don't know what's on the other side of that. It's the most fundamental change that humans could undergo, I think, fundamentally, because they would stop being human in some sense. They would become their own creation.
Well, also, you would need to have trust. And that's not something we have in our system. I mean, our system is leverage, interrelated relationships. How can you get X amount off of people, maximize your profit, that type of stuff, which means that it is hard to trust that whoever has that technology and that level of leverage won't use it for some kind of nefarious ends. So it becomes, you need a different world almost, where you can trust your institutions and trust that the people around you are looking out for your best interests. This is not that world, which makes that technology that much more treacherous.
It's true. All right. You know what? We're going to go into a break. We are taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news commentary and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to us, apparently. We are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking calls 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. Also, I'm going to give this out. We have callers on the line, so I'm kind of being a jerk by avoiding them, I suppose, for a second. But to give you info, here's where you can listen to us. We are on the radio in Washington, D.C., 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM there. We also are all over the place online. At last count, we're on like 7 platforms, 8 technically. I'll just reel them off. The audio ones, you can catch us on Apple Music, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Stitcher, and Spotify. Over on YouTube, you can catch us by video. Just do a search for Jamarl Thomas or Fault Lines Radio. Fault Lines Radio, you'll find our main feed. Subscribe to that. Jamarl Thomas, do a search for him. That's live. So if you subscribe to him and follow him every morning, you'll see him live. You'll see his video live. Pardon me, it's not just live. It's with video, live video. Also, over on Twitter, twitter.com/faultlinesradio. You go there right up top. You will see our Periscope. Follow us on Twitter. Like and share that stuff. Like and share it all. Heck. Again, though, we're taking calls 202-521-1320. And we have a few. Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What is going on?
Guys, I just want to chime in real quick on the whole thing with getting rid of poverty in our time.
I lived in Germany for about 6 years, 4 years as a soldier and 2 years as a civilian. And I mean, you could argue that there's definitely corruption in their government. They deal with the same frustrations, but crime-wise, crime is extremely low, if any, except for like in major cities and stuff like that. And those usually stabbings and stuff. I think the issue here is more about, from what I've seen there versus it's more about culture, I think. The culture and our societal structure, our social structure, because it seems like here at home, it's almost like our society is engineered in a way whereas we're preying, those with the most are preying on those with the least. And that's the structure of it, and that's acceptable. And sometimes I wonder if when they're saying, "Oh, America is the greatest land," I wonder if that's the reason why they view it as the greatest land, because you can legally prey on those with the least. You know what I'm saying? So just as an example, over there, I remember going over as a soldier. I first deployed there, coming from Atlanta, where crime is crazy, right? 2 o'clock in the morning, me and some other soldiers were going to a club and stuff, and we're just walking around downtown. There's no crime, no threats of anything. Whereas here in Atlanta a few years, I mean, this is some time ago, but I was in downtown Atlanta with my then girlfriend, and we were walking around, and we almost got robbed like 2 different times. And you see what I'm saying? So I wonder how much of our social structure has to do with the fact that we can't get rid of poverty, because if you're out of work, you don't have to worry about how you're going to make your bills, until you find a new job. If your job trade becomes irrelevant, there's training for a new job that's provided by the state. And here, while we have those programs, there is no padding for poverty. As a matter of fact, the padding for poverty, the so-called padding for poverty that we have here, it perpetuates poverty, because if you make more than a certain amount, or if you're trying to do certain things, or if the father's in the home, then they take those paddings away from you. You see what I'm saying?
Brave.
So I wonder if
1,000% agree with you. 1,000% agree. I've been to Germany, I've been across the world, and you can see how those countries deal with issues of poverty. And oftentimes what you see is less poverty, significantly so, and less crime. And Americans don't get that perspective around the world. I mean, look, oftentimes this notion of unity and all this other stuff is just propaganda for elites to con people that they're equal, that they're pulling for the same ends. Meaning Jeff Bezos is not united with me because Jeff Bezos is a fundamentally different life than I have. He can't even understand my life in real terms. And so it's like if you come together to say we're the United States and you act as if all of our lots are pulling in the same direction, when really one side of that is getting exploited. The lion and the tiger saying, yeah, we're united with these lambs over here and these baby goats. Yeah, I bet they would want those baby goats and those lambs to believe that all of them are united, all of them are pulling for the same ends. You're 1,000% correct. Those countries deal with poverty. Ours doesn't. And this is the results of basically that very specific cultural, or if you want to call it predatory, aspect of our system. 1,000% agree.
There's one way I want to push back here. And I don't even know that I'm pushing back. It's more like this is something interesting that I haven't heard other people talking about that I found out within the past day or so. If you do a search, if you just go to Google and you do a search for NICS firearm checks, three distinct words there or whatever, NICS firearm checks, just that, what you should find either right up at the top or pretty close to the top is a little chart that's compiled that like puts together how many background checks are initiated through the service, the NICS, on every month, on a monthly basis, on a year-by-year basis too. So you can see it broken down by month by month, and also the totals for the year. So far in 2020, we're like breaking crazy records. So it started in March, where, as far as I can tell, I mean, it started earlier than March even. It's weird, but it started in March, where it's like over 1 million. Usually you get like 2,700,000, 2,600,000, something like that, background checks. In March, that's the case in 2018, it was like 2,767,000. 2019, 2,644,000. In 2020, in that same month, it was 3,740,000. So it had jumped by 1 million. Next month, it's about 600,000 above average. Next month in May, it's about 800,000 above average. Next month in June, it's like 1.6 million above average, and the same thing in July. We don't have records out for August. My point is, every one of these months going back for a while, just looking at it quickly, but I was looking at this the other night too. We've been breaking records. So I wouldn't associate it. Maybe you associate that with the virus, but it seems like you associate that with the civil unrest you're seeing in the streets, and maybe people being worried about police, a combination of these issues. But probably for the largest part, it's the protests that turned into rioting. It's the stuff that started out as rioting, and then it's videos of violence and stuff that people are seeing. I don't know that was created by poverty, though. It seems like, and I'll put it like this. If what makes it likely for police to shoot people, and if part of what the deeper problem is that we're living in a society that's so deeply saturated with gun violence, it seems like these protests led to more gun sales. And let me be very clear, not the protests. It seems like the sort of aggressive, outbursty, dissident wing of the protest that turned into rioting led to more gun sales. It seems like that deep civil unrest created this sort of feedback loop that will then create more civil unrest, more violence in our society, et cetera. What am I missing there? Again, I'm not pushing back because I'm just trying to
I do think
it's not
it's
in
protests
necessarily, but
I do think it's the protests that causes people to buy the guns. I mean, it's a rational act, right? If you're a member of the society, you see a lot of chaos. You see people in the streets. You see some rioting. You see even people that are just in the streets in general that may bother you per se, and you say, I need to protect my family. I don't know what's going to happen. You see people being evicted from their homes. You see people being not just evicted from their homes, standing in food lines and everything else. And you look at your life and say, I may need to protect myself because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. This world has fallen off its axis. And as such, you have a president that's attacking the political system, which is astonishing. I've never seen anything like it. Basically saying, who knows who's going to win that election? You have another party doing something similar. And you have chaos. And so if you're asking like, what's the thing that's pushing the gun sales? Well, that's what's pushing the gun sales. Your society has devolved into chaos. And as such, people feel that they need to take precautions to protect themselves and their families. I just want to make the point that I think this goes beyond just the notion of the protest in and of itself. I think it's all of it. Because if you think about a society as it unravels, and I kind of want to get with this Wolff, and you start looking at these things that you trusted before, that you didn't have to deal with before. And now all of that stuff seems to be, at the very least for a large segment of the population, gone to pot. So you, being a rational person who love your family and protect your family, what is in your head? I need to protect my family. Like, so I don't, it doesn't shock me that those background checks expand. It's somewhat of a rational act. We have Eric. Let's go to Eric next.
No, it is.
Okay.
Let's do it. Yeah, that's what I was saying too. Eric in New Jersey, you're on.
Okay, yeah. On that last one, look, when society's social contract breaks down and you no longer feel protected by the institutions that were supposed to protect you, you're going to find ways to organize your own protection, including buying yourself a gun. If you can't trust society and the police to do the job for you, you do the job for yourself. It's the same impulse that drives community organizing when the state fails people for things like not providing, services like the food bank and stuff like that. Anyway, I did want to talk about that. I did want to talk about this whole thing about, class reductionism and being related to this whole mystery about crime. There's no mystery about crime. I'm going to start off with China, go to Black Lives Matter, and then come back to China. Basically, China, Confucius figured this crap out thousands of years ago. If you raise people from poverty, you reduce the crime limit. And it happened exactly the way he said it would. And what's interesting is he didn't have a social democracy. Obviously, this was an empire, so he implemented a social imperialism in that they raised people out of poverty. Suddenly, China's economy became extra strong during that period of time, and on top of that, crime was reduced because people don't tend to commit crimes when they're not desperate. On that front, going to the Black Lives Matter and reparations thing, if you raise people up with universal programs, you can allow people to get reparations that will stay actual reparations, because if you don't fix the problems of injustice and economic injustice, what's going to happen is if you'll give reparations and it'll flow straight back to the top, and the community will remain the same, only having a brief spurt of, having some money for once. And then going back to China, the reason why China is doing so freaking well is because labor got exported straight to China. And wherever you have mass labor concentrated, especially industrial labor, the kind of labor that produces things, then they have the power to organize on a mass level and make their lives better. And there we go. That's what I had to say.
You know what? I don't even think I have enough time for a response. Thank you for the call. That was an intelligent call. Good points. Eric from New Jersey, thank you for that. We've got Ben from Ohio calling in. Ben, you're on the air. What's going on?
Hey, how are you?
Good. How's it going? What's on your mind?
Just one comment in regards to like the reparations thing. My issue has nothing to do with what happens after it has been administered, so much as the fact that it is a debt that is owed. So just pay it. Essentially, like it's very basic logic. It's not like well, after I give you this $20, what are you going to do with it? It's like it doesn't matter. It's not like you owe me. Like just do it. Like that. I know that may seem somewhat simple, but I feel like all those other things are sort of like red herring. Not like they're invalid structurally, but that's just my perspective on it. In regards to Jamal's question regarding policing, about the whole, it's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. So I'm thinking about it from like a social psychological perspective, right? Where like we have this concept of like American exceptionalism, where that concept only applies to those that already have power and are charged with trying to secure the state, but it's not to the civilian or the suspect. I mean, the cops don't think, well, it's better to have this guy judged by 12 than carried by 6. Like, it's not that thought, and we don't hold them accountable for that. And I think that goes back to like the history of policing, where they were basically constructed as an entity to protect like powerful merchants. They were slave catchers, things like that. I think that's so heavily ingrained into the structure of our culture that we really only think that power can protect us from power instead of like the other way around. So I don't know. But anyway, that's just my personal opinion. So,
Ben, I want to thank you for the call. We're going to have to go to a break. That was Ben from Ohio. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main ISIS, and there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunday, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of, and I think that we're very naive when we the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Hello, Professor Wolff. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
We're the ones in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the wons who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you from the capital of the world, Washington, D.C. We have a great guest for this hour. Joining us is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and host of the Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff, airing on Democracy at Work channel on YouTube. We have Professor Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jamarl. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. I have to start it off here. What does it look like when countries, and I'm asking this question mechanically and socially, collapse? And let me give context. Joe Biden has been signaling or signaled through the Wall Street Journal that he's looking at austerity. He's saying that basically the cupboards are bare. And so, there's going to have to be austerity. This is one of his surrogates, part of the transition team. You've had two beauty pageants that, despite the world falling off of its axis, millions of people in regards to getting thrown out of their homes, hundreds of thousands that are dead, even from the standpoint of the people that get ill and are going to have to get medical bills, or the retail stores that are closed, or the downstream effects. The world has fallen off its axis, and we're still in the middle of a COVID crisis. Now, from the standpoint of the politicians, they act as if this is not happening. And they give two beauty pageants that has America as an afterthought. I watched that and I thought to myself, this is going to collapse. There's no way this can keep going like this, where the political parties seem to just be utterly and completely detached from any notion of philosophical responsibility to the officers or to the people. Where does this end? And how does this look when empires fall? And does it look anything like what we're seeing now in our political system?
Well, I think you're pointing to something that psychologists have a word for. It's called denial. It's when you have a problem, whatever it is in your life, but instead of trying to get your head clear to understand the problem, to see where it comes from, to begin to try to develop a strategy for solving the problem, instead you're so upset by the reality of that problem that you decide instead not to see it, to pretend and to demand that the people around you join you in pretending it's not there. I'm reminded of what I once saw my, at that time, 2.5-year-old daughter do. We were walking down the street and a neighbor's dog came running out. No danger, just a dog wagging its tail. But my daughter was a little scared. And so she did a remarkable thing. She raised her hands, put them across her face so that they covered her eyes, and you could see her whole body relax. She was okay because the scary doggy was gone. Why? Because she put her hands in front of her eyes, and because she didn't see him anymore, well, then he wasn't there. You hope that a human being matures and figures out that the dog is still there if you cover your own eyes as a way of coping, and that it really won't work real well. I think that's where we're at. I think the beauty pageants, the Democrats and now the Republicans, are exactly that. They are pandering, they are furthering, they are serving denial, that they think that the way to get votes in this country at this time is not to face those problems, not to come up with serious solutions, which will be costly. That will scare people. They don't want to hear it, is what their thought is. And so we're going to join the chorus of denial. It's not there. We can talk about all the things that we always talk about in the happy comfort that this process of denial will get us votes, is what the people want, and therefore that's what we're going to do. And you're right. The only thing you can be sure of with such a display is that the problems will get worse because nothing remotely like a solution is coming.
With nothing coming, let me ask you this. How does this track with other governments that have collapsed? Because I look at this as an economic system and a political system. They're basically intertwined with one another. It's hard to talk about one without the other. And in other countries that have had those systems that have fallen apart, how has that basically looked? And does it look anything like what we're seeing now?
Yeah, I think it has looked this way. I'm not at all. I mean, if you wanted me to be blunt, but to be honest, I'm not surprised about this. I've seen these problems get worse and worse. I have seen effort after effort, either to pretend they're not there, or, and this has to be said, even worse, if you look at what was actually done over the last 6 months, since this crash of capitalism and this virus really hit us in March, you look at the period since then, this society has put a Band-Aid on a cancer for the mass of people. Meanwhile, it has flooded the stock market with new money created by the Federal Reserve, given to the investors who bid each other up the price of stocks so their portfolios all look wonderful. These are acts of denial, acts of a kind of crazy notion that the people at the top can play these stock market games while the rest of the society falls apart. Let me tell you what the history suggests. You know, there's the old joke. You know, Rome was burning, but the emperor was playing the fiddle on the veranda, because for the emperor, for the people at the top, these are all minor inconveniences. If you can't live safely in your apartment, well, then you go to your country house. And if you can't run your business this way, well, you'll run it that way, or you won't run it for a while. You know, this is the richest Congress in the history of the United States. The overwhelming majority of our political leaders are dependent on money from the people at the top and are themselves part of the people at the top. That's part of the intertwined politics and economics you just referred to. And for them, this is what the British used to call a rough patch. It's a period of difficulty that doesn't threaten their wealth, their dominance, their social position. It's an inconvenience. They're not facing eviction. They're not facing the loss of a job. They're not facing the implications of unemployment compensation being cut drastically. Those life-changing realities are not their reality. And like my little daughter, they keep their hands firmly in front of their eyes, convinced that we'll get through this rough patch, and they will be as dominant, if not more so, at the end than they were going in. And that's what they want from both political parties.
Let me is from the standpoint of the dollar and from the standpoint of the way that other nations regard the dollar, especially going through all of this, is there some level of, let's say, either mitigation of either the effects of the dollar, or for that matter, let me ask this question a slightly different way. The unemployment numbers continue to go up. And the Trump administration was thinking that there was going to be this kind of uptick in America. It's like you cut the light on and all the jobs come back. Well, that's not going to happen. And so You're seeing retail with with millions of people out of a job. I think like 30% of retail up in flames, with unemployment numbers still continuing to go up. Now, is Trump wrong? Are those unemployment numbers going to continue to go up, especially with the money that Congress, the meager sum that Congress was given to the various people in the country, being gone? It's eliminated now. And so basically you have people back to square one economically. Are those numbers for unemployment going to continue to rise?
At this point, you'd have to say yes. The only way you could stop that, well, there are two ways. One of which is the one they should have chosen right from the beginning, but they didn't. So I would guess the chances of their doing it now are next to zero. And the second one is the one they did a little bit, stopped doing, and could resume. Let me explain. The thing that could have been done and should have been done, and in other capitalist countries it was done, was never to allow this unemployment in the first place. And the way to do that was simple and could be adapted from American history because it's what we did in the 1930s. That was the last time we had unemployment on a scale anything like what we have now. What did we do? Well, from 1934 till 1941, that's the overwhelming bulk of the Great Depression, the government hired people. That's right. You lost your job in the private sector, you got hired next week, next month, by the government to do all kinds of socially useful things. You went to work as a government employee, you got paid properly as a government employee. That allowed you to continue shopping, that allowed you to cover your mortgage payments or your rent payments for your home, and to feel good about yourself. You're doing a job. And by the way, wonderful things were done by public employees in the 1930s. Let me give you a couple of examples. Some of the most beautiful parks in the West, those national parks that Americans go to and marvel at the natural beauty, etc., those were created by workers hired by the government after they lost their private sector jobs. Here's another example. Artists of all kinds, singers, dancers, actors, sculptors, painters, all the arts. The government said if you lost your job in a theater, if you lost your job in a craft museum, we will hire you. And you're a skilled artist, and we're going to form artist teams, teams of actors, teams of singers, teams of painters, and send you all across the country offering classes and performances and whatever you do to masses of people who've never had access to culture like that. It was called the WPA, very, very famous program, and it was a wonderful way to keep people working and to do things socially more useful than anything they had done as private employees before. You turned unemployment from a disaster into a social asset. That could have been done now. It should have been done now. Some of the earliest ecological reclamation of land and of protecting the environment, those were done in the 1930s by government hired people who had gotten government jobs to do that kind of work instead of their private lost jobs from before. That's what should have been done in March. That's what could have been done all summer. Then you could have given people money, but you would have gotten back from them real services for all of us. Plus, they're not having to go through all of the psychological and personal trauma of unemployment when it lasts.
Professor Wolff, let's cut in for one moment. We have to take a break. I'm going to bring you back and we can get right back into this. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Professor Wolff, Professor of Economics, Emeritus University of Massachusetts. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back.
Welcome back.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Wolff. We've got Richard D. Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the host of Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff, airing on the Democracy at Work channel on YouTube. By the way, quick promo for him too. On Twitter, you can follow him. Just go to Prof. Wolff. That's PROFWOLFF. 2 F's there at the end. Professor Wolff, thank you again for being with us. Thank you for joining us. Quick question there on the end. You were talking, you were waxing poetic and praising the WPA, the Workers' Progress Administration, under Roosevelt, the various programs in the 30s. How would that work now, though? And specifically during a pandemic, how would it work to have people out, what would they be doing? I mean, we've talked about this with people before. I could see room for something like that. It's definitely echoing. We're in a financial crisis that seems to parallel, if not surpass, the legacy of the Great Depression. But so I could see a conversation around that. But we're also all stuck in our homes. What kind of work would you actually have people doing in these programs?
Well, I think the first thing, and it's a great question, and it's one that's asked often. Let me answer it this way. The first thing that we need, and that we should have done from the beginning, was to address exactly the problem of how we run a society when we have to protect ourselves against a virus like this. Or to say the same thing in simpler English. If you want, for example, your school system, which you knew was ending one school year, March, April, it usually ends in May, and would resume this fall in a few weeks, as we know. One of the first things you would have used an army of unemployed people to do if the government hired them was to reconfigure and reorganize schools, keeping everybody 6 feet apart, keeping everybody in a mask, doing all the things that we've been doing anyway. You would have set people to work to create classrooms in which the desks were far enough apart, ways in which you could utilize all kinds of other buildings that sit empty or unused or underused in the community that could now be brought in so that they could house students appropriately distanced from one another with masks, etc. Here's another thing. You could have hired back teachers. You could have looked at the population as a population of people who could teach all kinds of things, even if they hadn't been teachers before. Hire them. Change the model of teaching for the duration of the pandemic. Instead of gathering large numbers of kids in a room, make it a tutorial. Make it a system in which one teacher is paired with, 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 young people teaching during the day in a safe environment, carefully cleansed. And who does the cleaning? The unemployed. Who does the monitoring? The unemployed. Who reconfigures the spaces? The unemployed. All of this can be done. Let me remind you that during the last 6 months, buildings were built, things were done, workers were working. You could have had the unemployed alongside them, suitably, safely distanced and all the rest, but doing all the things that we need to do. Let me put it yet another way. We are right now threatening, and that's the only honest word to use, threatening millions of workers with a choice. Either you go back to work, or we're cutting your unemployment, or not giving it to you, or we may take away the job forever. We may deny your eligibility for government program. Unbelievable. The government is threatening the mass of the working class when it has not, let me underscore this, it has not threatened the employers with having not spent the money to make the workplace safe. I mean, this is beyond words what history is going to remember about this period, whether it's President Trump telling the meatpacking workers after the record corona infections they suffered that they had to go back to work in the meatpacking plants because we have a food need. Did he order the meatpacking companies to make the place safe? Not a word. Did he threaten them? Not at all. It was the workers who got the attack. What's going on here is a tremendous failure to undertake the kinds of steps that could have and should have been done. We could have reconfigured, for example, city streets on a temporary basis, using the tens of thousands, the millions of unemployed. Rerun the streets, make the streets pedestrian malls so that restaurants and stores can empty out, at least in the warm weather, so that we can have the space and the outdoorness that makes some degree of restaurant, some degree of store shopping, safe for everybody, and the cleaning on a continuous basis. One last example. We still have not tested the vast majority of Americans for the virus. We don't know where it is exploding. We don't know what parts of the population need special attention so that all of us are not put at risk. Testing is what we needed, and millions of people could have been quickly hired by the government, given a proper training for a few weeks, and then sent out to do the first intelligent thing a pandemic needs, which is testing people, repeatedly testing people, making it possible, for example, for us to know that in a certain area or in a certain industry, having tested everybody in it, which takes time, but not if you have millions of people doing it, then you would know that this is safe here. It's kind of safe to go into a restaurant when it's set up this way. It's kind of safe in this area, and we can then figure out why is it the disease low in this area and higher in the other. We could have done, on a proper scientific basis, the kinds of work had we put the unemployed together. Would have paid them, but that we were doing anyway with the $600 and extra. So you could have done way better than what we did had you learned the lesson. And it's not only is it inferior to simply throw money at people rather than get them to do socially useful work. It's better for them, it's better for us. But now you see the horror of what Jamarl was asking me about before the break, that if they take away the $600, which they have now done, the extra for unemployed people, then what was keeping the retail sector going, all the statistics are there, is that monetary help to the unemployed. You take that away, you're giving another blow to the retail sector, and that's why you're beginning to see unemployment go up again. So if the government doesn't come in to fix that, we're going to see rising unemployment. Once again, utterly unnecessary, utterly unjustifiable. I mean, you have not spent anywhere near as much money on the mass of the people as you have spent trillions for the people at the top who are speculating in the stock market with that money. And if you believe that the helping the people at the top will, quote unquote, trickle down to everybody else, it means you haven't been paying attention, because the trickling is only in the mind. It never actually gets to the bottom. So that it has always been people like me, and I'm not the only one, who say, why don't we change and have a policy that we call trickle up? You give the vast majority of the money to the people at the bottom, those who obviously need it most. Let them go out there and spend the extra money you're giving them, and that will buy the goods and services that generate the profits for those at the top. That way you're helping those who need it most, and you're believing in the trickle-up effect of doing that, and that's going to help a lot more people than the trickle-down nonsense that is the justification for what they've been doing.
Professor Wolff, we have about 3 minutes left. And as I listen to you, something comes into my mind in regards to a question, analogy. People push for $15 an hour minimum wage. Let's say fight for 15. And as they push for this, the owner gets annoyed with the workers and says, fine, you're all fired. And he puts in a robot for $14.95. Now, those workers are out of a job. Now, those workers were right to fight for that $15 an hour because they were fighting for a living wage. By the same token, the owner class, who looks at this as a competition, decided, I'm just going to put in a robot. And then gets to the point of automating the entirety of it, saving a nickel in the process. Now, as we move forward in time, workers have to fight this, right? I mean, this becomes one of those issues that workers, with the owner class, has just one more weapon in their quiver, or one more arrow, to undermine any notion of organization and labor. How do we as workers mind that gap and fix that? Because it seems like the further in time you go, the weaker labor gets.
Well, the first thing you have to do is change your mentality, so you stop listening to or giving credence or believing in the nonsense that is said. It's as if we all went to some kind of mind altering school, and we're told that whatever is best for profit is what is best for all of us. That's not true. It never was. And you ought to understand that a business can be run around the notion we do here what's best for the majority in this business, and that's the workers. Workers' wages, workers' income, workers' balance between work life and home life. Those are the things that matter most, not the bottom line. Remember, profit, the bottom line, you know who gets it? The owners, the top executives. Of course, they want us all to think that what's good for profit is good for all of us, but it never was. What's good for profit is good for them, not for us. We could have run businesses around a completely different mentality. And let me give you an example that Americans sometimes seem to grasp. We don't run the military in this country around the notion of what's most profitable. We run the military around the notion, here's what our dangers are, here's what we need military security for, and that's what we're going to do. We don't ask the tank group to become profitable in their tanks, or the foot soldiers, or the airplane pilots. We train them to do a task that has to do with the problem they're supposed to solve. Hey, you know what work is? Work is an activity that produces the goods and services that the vast majority, working people, need to have a decent life. That's what work is for, not for the profits that go to a small minority. If American workers had that in their heads, understood that, they would never allow what is done in American workplaces today to continue to go on.
We've sadly got to cut it there, but thank you so much for joining us. That was the voice of Professor Richard D. Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the host of Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff. Airs on the Democracy at Work channel on YouTube. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I ended Richard Wolff a little bit early and accidentally ended the show also, but Shane is basically closing out. Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us. We had an extremely good show, spirited, back and forth, and not just spirited, but back and forth. We were able to get opposite opinions on, issues and topics that pertain to us now. Whether we're talking about the protests and we're getting the opposing viewpoints, and clearly, I have a certain point of view of those protests, but, it shows fault lines. And we are bringing people on to have those back and forths and to have those conversations. Shane and I disagree on various points, but there are things that happen in your larger society where you're going to have strong feelings about, and there are various ways that you can talk about them. The shooting is always somewhat contentious. Contentious for me because it's always weird to me that people will make an argument that life matters less than complying, even if what was happening in the non-compliance wasn't putting the officer's life at risk, or if there was a significant justification or reason that the officer believed his life was at risk. Any person could turn around and say, I was terrified. He was running away from me with his big black arms. Yeah, you could do that. Is it true? Every cop says, I was terrified. Sir, the guy was 20 feet from you and running the other way. But yeah, he could have turned around at any time. How did I know? He could have had a rock. He could have had a gun stashed somewhere. I mean, it gets lunacy at a certain point. Yes, you have to give deference, and you give this notion that that cop is a human being and that person wants to go home to his kids at night. By the same token, that cop can't put everything else as subordinate to that. There's another life at stake, even if that life isn't acting great. You can do maximum justice if that guy puts your life at risk, but it has to be credibly at risk. And it can't be all an absolute deference to the feelings or the perspectives of the cop, especially if there were other avenues that could have been taken rationally, reasonably, that could have ended up with that person still going home. But look, it's fault lines. We're going to continue to have those conversations. I think those conversations need to be had. So I'm going to stop it here. Like, share, and subscribe. Fault lines. And I want to thank everybody else who joined us for today. Also, let me make sure I haven't missed anyone. And we have... All right, right here. Xavier Foster, if you can go protesting, quote unquote, you can go and vote. Wesley Walker Jr., this guy is assuming that someone will commit a crime before it happens. This guy's assuming that someone will commit a crime before it happens. I think you're making the point that no crime had taken place. And, you know, whatever you want to say, that guy's a warrant, this is somewhat irrelevant to the point that your job is not to execute. Your job is to maintain order to some degree, even amongst yourselves. Like, look, I'm not one of those people that immediately jump on the cop. I am one of those people that can look at a situation and say, that cop had other avenues, and those should have been pursued, especially in the context of their life. So I feel you on this, Wesley Walker. All right, I'm going to say like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks, everyone.